2008, Chase Distillery launched. I guess you were building a little bit before that. According to my calculations, at that time there were only 7 distilleries in England. So when you were making this distillery in Herefordshire to produce a potato vodka, what was going through your mind at that time?
Well, it was completely accidental, because actually the reason that Will Chase took me on was not to build a distillery, it was to build a muesli factory. So I used to have a breakfast cereal company up here in North Wales. I don't know why I'm pointing, but it's over that direction.
We'll spin the camera out to the rolling Welsh fields.
So I used to have that, and we sold it. And as part of the deal, I had to work with the people who bought it for a year and to integrate the two businesses. And a friend of mine was doing some interim management work for Tyrrell's potato crisps. And when Will mentioned to him that he was thinking of getting into breakfast cereals, then my friend said, well, I know just the guy you need to talk to. And the reason Will wanted to do it was because he'd made a very successful business with Tyrrell's crisps. And one of the things that set that company apart from all the other people who were doing pretty much the same was that we grew the potatoes on the farm where we turned them into the finished product, the crisps. But you can't grow potatoes year after year in the same field. You have to rotate crops. So for 4 years out of 5, he was growing a crop that he didn't actually need, either oilseed rape or a cereal of some sort. So he thought, well, I've made quite a lot of money turning these potatoes into crisps. How about it? Can I turn some of these other crops that I'm growing into other added value products? So he was going to either build a oilseed rape oil factory, or he decided muesli in the end, and he took me on, and I booked a holiday.
So does that mean oats then?
Yeah, with muesli, you can grow some of it, but you can buy a lot of it in as well.
You're probably not going to grow all of it, right? When you think about all the different nuts and fruits.
Yeah, exactly. Some of it can be quite exotic.
Yeah, exactly.
But Will's, one of the things that made Tyrrell's crisps successful, and as I said, there were lots of other people doing very, very similar things with using the same equipment and the same flavour companies and all this sort of stuff. One of the things that set Will apart and Tyrrell's apart was the fact we were growing our own ingredients. So even with the muesli, we wanted to grow as much as we possibly could ourselves on the farm and just convert it. And it's a very green thing to do anyway, and it's quite trendy nowadays. I suppose it probably was at the time as well, but we just didn't think of it in that way. It was just the logical thing to do. It's again with distilling, when you look at the history of it, it was all to do with distilling what grows around in your area. So in the Mediterranean countries and hot climates, they grow grapes, and so when they distill, it's brandy. Here in the frozen north, it's grains and potatoes. So we make vodka and gin and whiskey and so on. So we wanted to do the same with the muesli. But I'd booked myself on holiday before I joined the company, and this was in 2006. So I ordered all the equipment and went on holiday. And when I came back, Will said, muesli's bloody boring, Jamie. Do you want to make potato vodka instead? So I thought about it for about a millisecond and thought, yeah, this could be interesting. And so let's give it a go. And none of us knew anything about the industry. I mean, you came to visit us quite soon after we opened, and it must have been quite obvious to you that we didn't have a clue about how the industry worked and the hospitality side of things. And you were our customers, we just thought, well, if we make a good product, that will be enough. And we learned very quickly that there's quite a bit more to it than that.
So what was the learning process like of turning from sort of cereal manufacturing to, I mean, I guess it's still machinery, it's still process, it's still a factory, effectively a distillery is, right? Although we like to glamorize it in certain other ways. What was the learning process for you? Yeah,
for the vodka, it was just another way of processing starch, effectively. I'd done that all my working life. I'd worked in the food industry pretty much all my working life. We were in the fortunate position because Tyrrell's was making a lot of money, so he was able to pay me to sit there and teach myself how to distill. So I went on a 2-day distilling course in America and a road trip around a few distilleries, including one potato distillery, Cold River in Maine, up in the northeast. Beautiful.
Yeah, I've not been there, but I know the distillery. Yeah.
And I just did. We had all these Polish guys phoning us up as soon as word got out. I can teach you how to make potato vodka. Just pay me an awful lot of money, sort of thing. But we were. Farmers just don't like consultants, and they don't like spending money in general. So we just thought we'll do it ourselves. And we were so naive looking back on it. And I think that actually worked in our favour, because if we had known a little bit about it, we probably wouldn't have had the nerve to do it. But Will was in the happy position where Tyrrell's was making money hand over fist. I'm probably not supposed to be saying that, but anyway, he sold the business later for an absolute fortune. But it was very profitable business as well. So he was able to afford to have a bit of a go, I suppose, and also to afford to pay me to do half my time doing product development for Tyrrell's Crisps and the other half learning how to distill.
Yeah. And I suppose it also had the cash to market it pretty successfully as well, which you need to do with an English potato vodka, because it was such a wild idea at the time.
Yeah, as you say, there weren't many distilleries in England at the time. It was a very, very different place, craft distilling.
Yeah, well, I did write them down because I was trying to make sure I had them all. So you had Beefeater and Plymouth, the two sort of main, if you like, branded gin distilleries. Then there was 3 other gin distilleries or white spirits distilleries. So Greenall's up in Warrington, well, not far from here actually, really, is it? Langley Distillery, Birmingham direction. Thames Distillers in London. So they're all pretty big, well-established distilleries, if not very new, then very, very big. And some of them very old as well, of course. And then you had, in addition to that, and you can think of 1 or 2 others, but I think this is probably it. So you had the St. George Distillery making whiskey in Norfolk. And then you had Somerset Cider Brandy.
That's right.
Somerset. Am I missing any?
I think there might have been a guy not far from us, actually, in Herefordshire, based near Ludlow. I think he was distilling quite early on.
Okay.
What was his name? Mike Harding.
Okay. What was he making?
Sort of Schnapps and Eau de Vie.
Oh, okay.
And that sort of stuff.
Right. But I think it's important to emphasize, because it's so easy. I mean, we're only talking, it's not even 20 years ago, but the way in which sort of distilling is taken off in the UK, and you're definitely partly responsible for that, and we'll get into this. It's so easy to forget that it's such a new thing still.
Yeah.
And particularly on the craft distilling side of things, all of the preponderance of gin distilleries we have now, there literally was not one at that time.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people say that it was actually illegal to operate small stills at that time, but that's not quite right. It wasn't illegal. It's just that HMRC didn't want to grant a license to smaller distilleries. I think they felt it was easier to control a smaller number of bigger distilleries, rather than get to the situation where we are now and have people distilling all over the place and all the horrors that entails in terms of the admin side of things for them. So yeah, there weren't any. So we quickly found out there was nobody able to help us with it, so we had to do it ourselves. We didn't know that Sipsmith were going down the same path at the same time, and so was Ian Hart of Sacred Spirits. And we all sort of came to production at roughly the same time. It wasn't a race, because we certainly didn't know that they were doing it, and I don't know if they knew we were doing it. But it wasn't a race, but we won. We were first.
You were definitely first mover, although of course it took you at least a couple of years before you started making gin, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it was always designed to be a potato vodka plant first and foremost. So I joined in 2006, I think, roughly this time of year, and we got into production 2008. We always say April Fool's Day, but that wasn't really true. But it was a nice story to tell. Oh, again, that's something I shouldn't say. But apart from that, the fact is, it wasn't marketing nonsense. What we were doing was growing the potatoes. We were storing them on site, which is not easy to do. It's much harder to store potatoes than it is to store grains. And so actually, when you look at Poland, which is almost the sort of spiritual homeland of potato vodka and potato spirits, very often the distilleries will make potato spirits for about 3 months of the year, and the rest of the time they turn their attention to grain, because you can store grain and then distill that whenever you want to. But potatoes are quite expensive and difficult to store. They have to be kept in the dark, at the right humidity, at the right temperature. Otherwise they start sprouting and rotting and all sorts of
So does that mean they're effectively large refrigeration units to keep them at the right?
Yeah, but for us that wasn't a problem, because we were still supplying the crisp factory with potatoes from the farm.
So you got 2 different streams.
Yeah. So the bigger potatoes went to the crisp factory, because when you slice them and fry them, they all crinkle over, so there's lots of airspace and the bags look full.
Yes.
Whereas the very small ones, He kept the seed potatoes, I think, for next year. So it was the sort of medium-sized ones that I had. And he used them as cattle feed, effectively. There was nothing wrong with them. They were clean and sound and wholesome, but they just weren't big enough for the crisps. So it was almost a free ingredient for me. It certainly was at first, and eventually we got a bit more professional. He started charging me from the farm.
It's funny, isn't it? Because, obviously it was emphasised right from the start as a farm distillery. And, there are many other distilleries now trading off that same kind of ethos of like, we grow it or to some extent, some degree of extent, they grow it and they process it themselves and so on and so forth. But it really is that kind of farm distillery mentality where you're like, right, how do we use up the surplus? Because that's really how these distilleries, the Scottish whiskey industry itself is founded. It's like, and American bourbon as well, and rye whiskey. It's like, what do we do with this stuff outside of the season? How do we add value to it? How do we store it in a smaller container? How do we ship this thing with the same value but at 1/10 of the size?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly, and it's not easy. I mean, I know they're renowned for complaining, farmers, but it's not easy making money just growing and selling a commodity crop. So anything that you can do to add value to that, and in Will's case, obviously, was firstly the crisps and then the vodka. But when you look at the pound equivalent for a ton of potatoes for each of those products, it's whereas a ton of potatoes was 40 quid, we were looking at 10,000 quid for a ton of potatoes once it's been converted into vodka.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was fun. So it took us 2 years really to work out what to do and then build and install the distillery. And I was the only employee of the distillery, so the first batch I had to do everything myself for the whole process. So what would ordinarily take a week took me about 7 or 8 weeks, because I had to peel the potatoes first and then mash them and then ferment them, and I couldn't be doing all the other stuff while I was doing those.
Just for the benefit of doubt, these are not peeled by hand, right? These are going through a rumbler machine or something.
It was so I said to Will, I want to peel the potatoes, because we had endless discussions about all sorts of things. And one of them was, should we peel the potatoes or not? And actually, it was a result of going to see this distillery in Maine that I mentioned earlier. He said to me that he had all sorts of problems with the fermentation because he didn't have a rumbler, or he didn't have a peeler. And so he was just... it's quite nice to use the term mashing, because it's a technical term for the brewing, but that's exactly what we were doing for the potatoes.
Same without the butter.
Yeah. We could have tried that.
Should have tried that, mate. Yeah. Special edition, Chase Lux.
Yeah. So he was cooking. So the first stage in making the potatoes is to mash them and convert them into quite a liquid slurry, and then you need to add enzymes to that. But before you can add the enzymes, you have to boil that slurry, because you have to cook the starch and gelatinize the starch. Otherwise, the enzymes won't work. And enzymes tend to be destroyed by heat. So once you put all that energy and money into heating it up and boiling it, you then need to put even more energy and money into cooling it down again. And that's where his problem was in Maine. Because he didn't peel the potatoes. When he then tried to run it through a plate heat exchanger, it just blocked up all the little holes. And so after his first couple of runs, he just didn't cool it and allowed it to cool naturally. Well, it took so long to lose all his heat, because you've got big batches at that scale. It took so long to lose all his heat that it became his fermentations were becoming infected with bacteria.
Right.
And I think he said of his first 26 fermentation runs, 7 of them had stuck and not completed the full fermentation. And it's to my utmost shame, I didn't know much about distilling, but I knew about processing starch. I could see exactly what his problem was, and I never said anything. I'm still embarrassed about that.
So it's basically lumpy mash.
Yeah. And he was even dipping the potatoes in bleach to try and, because they weren't peeled, of course, you've got the soil on the outside, and that harbours a lot of bacteria.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I said to Will, I want to peel the potatoes, partly because you can't ferment the fibre in the peel anyway, but mainly to get rid of the bacteria. And he said, well, I want a new Porsche, because that's roughly the same price as one of these rumbling machines. So in the end, it was a bit of a compromise. I got a broken down, knackered one out of the crisp factory, and we got it going again, and it worked really well.
Did you get a second-hand Porsche? Is that how?
An AV got
a brand new one.
Yeah.
So anyway, the gin. So once you got the potato kind of side of things sorted, you started making apple spirit as well, right? And then the gin alongside that.
Yeah, well, again, that was sort of accidental and because we didn't really know what we were doing. So we made the vodka and it did really well from day one. It was well received.
Yeah, I mean, actually, by the way, we should emphasize that it really was kind of a revelation, I think. It's not that potato vodkas didn't exist, but I think it was so striking that this was an English potato vodka. Also that it came from the same sort of stable as Tyrrell's, which is already a pretty well established and pretty well respected brand of crisps. And then when it came to the taste, it was like, wow, there's a real noticeable difference here in the character of this vodka. It's creamy, it's slightly vanilla-y, marshmallowy.
Yeah.
And then it started winning awards as well, right?
Well, we had some huge advantages that I didn't really appreciate at the time, but looking back now, having been involved with so many other brands and helped people get going, we already had a list of 10,000 customers of Tyrrell's potato crisps, and these were delis and farm shops and things like that, where we thought we could position the product, and they weren't really stocking spirits at that time. Now, most of those potential customers didn't have alcohol licenses because they were selling crisps and so on, but probably a third of them did. And we knew them all. We knew them all by name. So we pinched somebody from the crisp factory and she just phoned up all the people that she used to sell crisps to and says, oh, we've now got vodka as well. Would you like to buy some? So we had this ready-made audience for it and custom base for it, which is huge advantage. And yeah, the product was good. I like to... it sounds very conceited, but I wanted to make a vodka that whiskey drinkers would drink. You can't tell from my accent, but I'm a proud Scotsman, and I do like my whiskey. But yeah, and I didn't really know very much about vodka when we got into this, but I knew you could make it from potatoes, and in fact, I thought all vodka was from potatoes when I first started. But yeah, I wanted to make something that was really complex. So we did an absolute minimum of treatment post distillation. And it was really important in order to do that it had as much copper contact as possible during the distillation process as well. So we did things that you probably wouldn't do if you want to really make a proper commercial vodka. We had quite a long fermentation process. It was about a week, which is a long time in the vodka game. And
yeah, vodkas normally get it through fast, get it distilled fast, get it in the bottle fast. Yeah.
So we fermented it as normal with yeast, and then allowed a bit of malolactic fermentation afterwards, so a bit of bacterial infection.
Which is where a little bit of that vanilla-y kind of creaminess comes through.
Yeah. So that boosted the ester content.
But it's interesting. So I suppose you could have made a potato vodka without that, and then you wouldn't necessarily have got those things that we... Because this is the thing, when I think for a lot of people, when you drink potato vodka, you go, oh yeah, it reminds me a little bit of buttered mashed potato, or Chase vodka did. Yeah. But actually, maybe that was just part of your process rather than the material.
Yeah, there's a bit of both. I mean, I've started drinking vodka again, actually, recently, and I've got to come across a couple of really good examples. But until recently, I would only ever drink potato vodka. I wasn't that keen on grain vodkas and vodka from other materials. But so I was a bit of a vodka snob, only potatoes. But you're right, and the Chase product was made really to what I wanted, and thankfully Will was singing from the same hymn book as well. So I remember the first batch coming out, and I was so proud of it. And I thought, I really hope Will likes this, because if not, what are we going to do? Because I'd poured my heart and soul into this, and I didn't really want to change anything. But thankfully, he was happy. He was really happy as well. But yeah, it did have these high ester notes. I think it's changed.
I suspect it has a lot. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I've not been involved for a long time, and the process will change. It's got bigger, so they put different machines in, etc. So the product has slightly changed.
Yes, well, I mean, definitely changed now, I should think, because it's moved to production altogether from its original home.
Well, I'm still drinking bottles from the very first batch.
So. Oh, yeah. Got a stockpile of the first batch.
Yeah, I've got a big cellar.
Yeah, nice. Cool. Maybe we should try some of that before I go. But yeah, so I don't want to labour on Chase too long, but you then moved on to the gin. So I'm just sort of interested in, I'm actually most interested in sort of your learning process as you kind of took these steps forward. So, come from a manufacturing background, understand starches and cereals, learning about potatoes, got this column still set up.
Yeah.
First commissioned column still in the UK for quite some time, I'd imagine. And you've got the vodka nailed. And then from there, the product started branching out. You were doing liqueurs, I think, pretty much from the start as well.
Yeah, pretty much. While we were trying to build up the customer base for the vodka, the liqueurs were a much cheaper
because the farm shop stuff works perfectly, right?
Shops, yeah, exactly.
So then the sort of step into gin, because gin, again, not to sort of labour this point, but the gin thing really hadn't started at this point. It was really not there at all. I think amongst bartenders and people into cocktails, they were starting to push, because the classic cocktail revival thing was happening, and so many of these cocktails contained gin, and there just wasn't a huge range of products out there.
Yeah, and there were only one or two sort of specialist gin bars at that time. What was the place in Soho, just off Soho? Graphic.
Yeah,
that was probably one of the first ones that I became aware of.
Yeah.
So yeah, we decided that would be our second product, and it's logical. We were making a white spirit, and to make vodka, you need to make neutral spirits, and that's then the base of any gin in Europe. And so we said we'll make a gin, and we sat down, we drank lots of gin as you do, and decided on the style that we wanted to create, and we wanted to make a crisp, elegant gin. And so I made a batch using our potato spirit, and it just didn't work. So potato vodka, I said I like it. It's rich, it's thick, it's creamy, it's slightly unctuous. None of those are what we wanted as the base spirit for the gin. So we thought, well, okay, how are we going to get around this? Well, we were growing a lot of apples. So the farm where the distillery is based is pretty much next door to the Western cider house, and we were already growing and planted quite a lot more orchards around the farm, partly to supply them. And so I thought, well, I could take some of those apples, just ferment them. It's easier to ferment apples than it is to ferment potatoes.
Sugar's there, you go, right? Yeah.
So I just put it through the same process, really, and made a neutral spirit from apples. And that was crisp and clean and slightly fruity, which was just what we wanted. And that became the base then of the gin. And we actually launched it as a vodka as well, under sort of Naked Chase brand, I think it was. Yeah. And it was quite an interesting product, and it didn't really catch on. It didn't sell in any significant volumes at the time. I don't know if it still exists. But I quite liked it. It had this little hint of fruitiness. You wouldn't have said apples, but you might well have said fruit.
And you had elderflower in there, I think, if I remember correctly. And I remember it being quite floral and quite fresh, like you say. It was not especially juniper driven. Like, it was a pretty kind of bright. I think you definitely lump it in that sort of new Western style of sort of moving away from juniper style gin.
That was because I didn't really know much about gin as I have learned since, if I'm brutally honest. And it is definitely of that style. I hate that term, New Western, by the way.
Well, so do I. I don't know what else you do. No. Non-juniper gin or non-juniper dominant gin, let's say.
I've taught a few courses in America teaching American distillers how to make gin, and that's one of my favourite lines, that I say New Western style is American for bad gin.
Yes. Well, I mean, New Western, not as a style, but as a term, never really caught on. Yeah. It was there, to be honest with you, I hadn't heard it in years, and I was talking to Angus Winchester a few months ago on the podcast, and he mentioned it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, yeah, I remember that. And I was like, well, we haven't really come up with a better way of describing what this sort of new wave of gin is, where there are other ingredients that are not necessarily dominant, but at least a sort of a dual leading character as juniper, Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that wasn't the intention. It was the way it came out. Yeah. And it was quite a nice product in its own right. But and again, you have to remember that it was a very different time then. There weren't. Certainly in the UK, there was nobody making that style of gin at the time. It was all London Dry and Plymouth, effectively. Mm-hmm. And those are fantastic products, don't get me wrong. But when you look at where gin is now, and you've got this plethora of different flavours and products and profiles, it's just absolutely extraordinary the way that category has gone and changed.
Yeah,
not always for the better, I'd argue as well. I like to pretend I'm hip and trendy and with it, but actually I'm an old stick in the mud. I don't like change.
We'll get back to the show shortly, but first I wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor, Fever-Tree. Fever-Tree have been my mixer of choice for more than a decade now, going right back to when I used them as our mixer at 15 in Cornwall in 2005. It's a very long time ago. This is a brand, of course, that made its name with tonic water, but to be honest with you, the thing that's going to be most excited at the moment is their range of ginger mixers. They have ginger beer, ginger ale, And then this product here, which is possibly my favorite in the entire range. Fever Tree Spiced Orange Ginger Ale. The product starts out just like their normal ginger ale, flavored with 3 unique gingers that harmoniously come together for a nice citric, zesty, but also subtly spicy ginger effect. Then 2 more ingredients are added. Cinnamon for a nice baking spice hum, and then fresh clementine, which really extends that citric flavor and adds weight and body to this ginger ale. I would happily drink this stuff on its own, but of course it's a mixer, and it's best served with a nice whiskey, extending out into a highball and adding some real length and depth to it. Don't be fooled by the name. It's spiced orange. It might sound like it's a wintry ingredient, but actually it works brilliantly in summer highballs. And since we're approaching that period now's the time to crack it out. So I was trying to work out how many distilleries there are in the UK now, and I guess you probably have a reasonable idea on what the number is. I found 2 completely conflicting numbers. So Spirits Business suggested at the end of 2023 that there were just under 400 distilleries, which sounded a bit low to me because that includes Scotland, which is a good 160, 170. And then I got another number from somewhere else where it was like 900, but I suspect, I feel like that might be over-egging it, and actually maybe that's referring to brands or something.
I think where the confusion might be, and to be honest, I don't know. I'm just postulating here that if you're going to try and find out these figures, where are you going to go? And you're going to try and get the information out of HMRC, and the term distillery is quite specific. It actually means somewhere where the product is fermented as well. So if you're making whiskey in Scotland, you're fermenting your product and turning it into a spirit. Whereas if you're a gin maker, you don't need to do the fermentation. You just need to buy in neutral spirits. And so technically you're rectifiers rather than distillers.
Yes.
So I think those difference in those figures, one is
fermenting and distilling and therefore more likely probably making whiskey or something of that ilk. And the other one is
actually both of them lumped together.
Gin and
So it includes distillers and rectifiers.
Yeah. So let's go with that. And if anyone has a big problem with that, they can shout at us in the comments. So then we're looking at about 900, maybe even 1,000.
Yeah.
How many of those do you think you have touched?
Oh, I built well over 100.
So that's like more than 10% of.
It's about 10%.
It's about 10%. Yeah. And when you take out Scotland, which is like, let's say close to 200 in malt whiskey distilleries, many of them old. So then you're actually only down to about, let's say 700 distilleries. So you're more like 15%.
Yeah. Well, as a proud Scotsman, it embarrasses me. I've only done one in Scotland. Yeah. It's so I left Chase in 2011, I think. And actually I realized just like the conversation we've just had, there was nobody really who had the same experience that I picked up completely by accident of building smaller scale distilleries. So I thought, well, I'll give this a go. I'll set myself up as a consultant and see if it works. And for a year, to be honest, it was hell. I had no money coming in. I did 1 or 2 little projects for guys, and I was on the verge of giving up when I got a phone call from Jonathan Clark, and he said, I want to build a distillery at the bottom of Fleet Street in at the heart of London. Would you like to come and help?
So was that the first one you did as a consultant?
Yeah, it probably was the first where I'd actually installed all the stills and everything. I'd done a bit of consultancy work for a few people who were already up and running. Again, there's another guy down in Actually, I think he's in Gloucestershire. He's right close to the border. He was making Schnapps products as well, with an old the wood-fired still in a beautiful, beautiful old barn that dates back to the Doomsday Book. And he set fire to it twice with this wood burning still. And he was making quite nice schnapps from the plums and apples and pears that grew around the distillery there. And he wanted a bit of help with something. It was a long time ago. I can't even remember what it was. I tried to persuade him to get into gin, but he quite sensibly decided against it. So yeah, I'd done a bit of work. And then when Jonathan phoned me up, he said to me, well, I actually want you to be down here. I said, well, I live in North Wales, that's I can't really do that. So I used to go down on a Monday morning and come back on a Thursday.
And this is the City of London Distillery.
Yeah. So, by this stage, there were probably a few other smaller scale distilleries had started to spring up around the UK. But one thing that hadn't happened, and the City of London was the first one, was to actually build effectively a commercial distillery fully visible from a bar. Now that was happening. It wasn't a brand new idea. It was happening in America with Alan Katz in New York and others.
Shanty, yeah.
Yeah. So Jonathan had this idea. I've got this space. I don't just want to run it as a bar because that's hard work, as you probably know. And he wanted to try something a little bit different because there are loads of bars in London. And at that time, we thought, well, this might be a way of attracting people to come and visit it.
I was trying to explain this to someone the other day as well, actually, about how there were no distillery bars 15 years ago. And it seems such a strange sort of version of reality now, because anyone who's got a bit of budget building a distillery these days, you're going to stick a bar, possibly even a restaurant in there as well. They're everywhere. I mean, East London Liquor Company, great example, where you can see the distillery from the bar. You literally sat at the bar looking at the distillery.
That's another one we built, by the way.
Yeah, another one. Yeah, I mean, we're going to tick off a few, I expect, just by pure statistical chance. And then the reason I was talking about the day is I was at Port of Leith Distillery. Have you been there?
No.
So
no.
vertical distillery, £13 million build, and they've got a beautiful bar and restaurant on the top above this vertical operating distillery. And I was explaining something the other day. I was like, the idea of a bar and a distillery 15 years ago. I mean, and again, like you say, I think there was an assumption there was some sort of legal obstruction there that prevented you from doing such a thing, I don't think there was. It's just no one was doing it.
No, well, to be honest, Jonathan is not the sort of person to allow that sort of thing to come between him and what he wants to do anyway. He told me a story about when he first took over the place, and they wouldn't grant him an alcohol license because they said there are enough bars in the city already. So he said, well, I need to sell alcohol. He said, and somebody made one of the licensing people made this sort of flippant comment, oh, we only license sports clubs now. So he opened it as the City of London Golf Club, and he put in a couple of driving ranges and this sort of thing, got his license, and then just ripped that out, and now it was a bar.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. Saying you had to find the loopholes. Yeah, brave. And by the way, a very small distillery and a small bar, right? But nevertheless, it did kind of... I think it was the first in the UK. I seem to remember that being kind of part of the press release.
Exactly. Yeah. That's another marketing story. The first day of production, I said to Jonathan, right, I'm ready to go tomorrow. I'll make our first batch of gin. And he said, okay, well, don't distill until after 6 o'clock in the evening. And I was just sleeping on a mattress in the back there, so it didn't bother me when I distilled. And I thought he was getting some important people to come and watch the process or something. But nobody turned up, and I distilled. And the next day he said to me, what time did you start distilling? I said it was about 20 past 6, maybe 25 past. So he puts out a press release saying, distilled in the City of London since 1823.
With a colon there or not? No. That's brilliant. Oh, I love that. It's like the people that put dots on their number plates to form letters. Yeah.
But we, the first batch, it was shortly before Christmas. And so I did the first batch, and I started bottling it. And as soon as the doors opened, people were just coming down and buying. As I put a label on it, they were buying the bottle and taking it away.
Beautiful bottles as well, I seem to remember. Was it Christopher Rhett gin, wasn't it? Yeah.
Again, he spent a bit of money later on and got a custom-made bottle. But actually, I quite liked the original design. It wasn't traditional in any way. But yeah, that was nice, and it was again. I think Jonathan is great. He plays the clown. He said, "Oh, I don't know anything about this industry and all this sort of thing," but he's sharp as anything. And he realised, okay, it's a small distillery. We can't make big volumes, so therefore we have to maximise the margin that we make on the products. And the way to do that is sell direct to the consumer. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of people walking past the front door every day. And if we have the bar and we start selling them as the product as gin and tonics as well, then the margin is even higher. And it's such a simple idea, but nobody had really done it before. So that was quite something. We ran out of money, of course, before we got into full production. So the bar looked like a sort of school canteen when we first opened up, and the floor, we put down a lovely floor. We bought it from an old gymnasium and had to sand everything down and paint it. But it had all the like basketball court paint on it at random, so I had to sand all that
random spots. Yeah.
And I did that really stupid thing that you see in all the cartoons. I varnished the floor. And I didn't finish at the door. I finished at the
trapped in a corner.
So I had to spend the night in this cupboard.
No.
Oh,
Oh wow!
It was great fun. I really enjoyed that, and it was nice. Just as I said, I was sleeping on a mattress was all great, but to be in the middle of London and just being able to walk up to Soho and come and visit you and your bars up at the. I think you opened the Whistling Shop place at roughly the same time.
Yeah. 2011 that was.
Yeah, it was lovely to get to be able to do that because I'm a country boy, as you can see.
So what's happened from there? So you've obviously gone on to open, commission, design, build tons and tons of distilleries. We're not going to go through every single one of them, though. If there's any in particular that stand out, then I'd love to hear the stories. But again, I'm sort of interested in your learning process as you've gone through all of this. Like, what mistakes were you making earlier that you then corrected later on? What were the kind of like aha moments, like, right, if I do it this way, I do it that way? And that, so from a process point of view, and also like from an equipment point of view, like what's changed in that sense as well?
Well, I'm naturally nosy and curious. I want to know how things work. So hence there's a grandfather clock on the floor there in bits. So hopefully it'll work again when it goes back together again. So that's, I'd really enjoyed building the Chase distillery because we were doing everything from the raw material potatoes, and I put everything together there with help, of course. But so I knew the inside as well as the outside of all the equipment, and I got to know how everything worked really well, and then I started learning more about gin as well, and started playing around with recipes, and was able to then start making more traditional flavors of gin, and also trying to work out how to get some unusual flavors into it as well. So again, when I finished at the City of London Distillery, by that stage, I was having a lot of people phoning me up and saying, I want to build a distillery, can you help me? And again, at that time, that was really when gin started to explode in a massive, massive way. And, I like to think, again, we were part of that, but Sipsmith were doing it before we were, and they're a massive, massive part of the history now of gin in the UK. And it was sort of seen as an older person's drink. It had lost its allure when vodka arrived and Smirnoff in the 1950s. But when the cocktail bars started appearing in London again, you'll correct me, I'm sure, but I think there are more classic cocktail recipes written for gin than there are for any other spirit. So
probably every other spirit combined. Yeah, the Savoy cocktail book's anything to go by. I think there's about 600 recipes in that book, and close to 500 I got gin in, I think, something like that. Yeah.
So all of a sudden, gin was in this perfect place because we had this long tradition of making beautiful, beautiful gin, and with the big brands. All of a sudden, we had this explosion of little distilleries, most of whom were starting to make gin because of all the spirits, it's by far and away the cheapest to start producing from an equipment point of view. And then we had all these cocktail bars starting to spring up, and all clamoring for gin and wanting to work with local people. So it really snowballed. It was absolutely extraordinary. So I was getting loads of phone calls from people wanting to get in on this, and some people were from the industry, but an awful lot of them were not. And so I started as a consultancy. Now I'm still doing that. There's two of us in the business. Graham's based in Leicester. I work from home, but we have to travel a lot. And we've done distilleries mainly in the UK, of course, but all over Europe and Africa. And I was in India a couple of years ago doing installing a still that we sold them and getting the product up and running. That was fantastic. That was quite a place. I hadn't when we quoted them for the still, I hadn't realised it was a massive distilling company in India in its own right. I thought it was just somebody who wanted to get started from scratch. And it's this company that I mentioned to you earlier that can make neutral spirit from basmati rice. So as part of that, now they're now producing a gin. So that was fun.
And so, what's changed in your sort of methodology over the years? Like, most of the stuff you've been doing is gin, right? I mean, it's sort of, I would
probably half of it. Yeah, at least
half of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what about the rest of it?
Maybe half to 2/3. Rum in particular has become more popular. I get more requests rather for rum in the last 5 years, I would think. I think there's now about 70 distilleries in England making rum from scratch, bought in molasses, and doing their own fermentation. There's lots more just buying in rum and doing either just bottling it or doing flavoured rums.
Flavoured rums, yeah.
there's probably about roughly the same number of English whiskey distilleries now as well. They're growing fast and doing some very exciting things.
I think there's about 50 at the moment, which is crazy as well. It's again with I guess with rum to some extent and whiskey to a greater extent, those numbers are going to come very apparent in the next sort of 5 years as all these distilleries come of age and start releasing products.
Yeah,
it's going to feel like the gin boom in a way, but with different spirits.
Yeah, so in terms of rum, because the aging process is not as strictly controlled as it is for whiskey, then you can release a product a lot earlier. But for whiskey, I mean, theoretically, you can release your product after 3 years and a day, but it's not worth drinking, is it?
No,
So,
not usually.
So a lot of the whiskey distilleries are making other products while they wait for their stocks to mature, and so I suppose Harris Distillery is a really good example of that. They became really well known for their gin and that beautiful bottle that they designed. But really, in the background, they're filling casks and releasing a whiskey eventually.
What mistakes were you making earlier on in your sort of development that you're now kind of like, I'm interested, because you've done so many distilleries, helped to formulate so many different gin brands. There must be some serious sort of learning processes along the way, post-Chase, where you've kind of picked up new, okay, well, we do it this way, we do it that way.
Yeah, as I said, I'm a nosy so-and-so, so I like to poke around other people's distilleries or factories. Anything you can learn something from going around a bird's eye pea factory, and you'll see a machine that's doing something, and you think, hang on, I could, I'm trying to do that in my distillery. I just need one of those, or I need to copy how that does it, because generally I can't afford what bird's eye is. And if I'm, my business, we don't actually make any stills. We just buy the equipment from other people. And it depends what product they want to make and how they want to make it. Then we would recommend different manufacturers. And then we buy it. And because we buy lots of stills, we tend to get a bit of a discount. And then we can charge roughly the same price. And that difference is our margin.
Sure.
So we'll install it for them. We'll commission it. If it's something simple like gin, where they need some help with recipe development, then we can do that on a very small scale as well. So done like countless recipes for gin in particular. And the more you do it, obviously, the more you start to understand how these things work. So, and now that the licensing laws are changing, I think I can do more of that work here at home and using duty paid alcohol without having to have a license on my personal premises. So that'll make my life a little bit easier. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Oh yeah, so now I've got hundreds of recipes in my mind, but I've never ever made two products the same as far as I'm aware. And this is going to sound a bit pretentious. If you were to come to me and say, I want to make a gin and I want you to design the recipe for me, it's almost like the difference between taking a photograph of you and painting a portrait of you. A photograph will be exactly what you look like, sort of thing, hopefully, even with my photography skills. Whereas a portrait, where a painter is trying to capture some of your character and your background, and I always think that the same with the recipe development for a gin. It's not just a question of throwing a few ingredients together. It's trying to get something that's relevant to you or your person or your place or your history. And yeah, that does sound pretentious, actually. But you know what?
Of course, I know. I mean, especially in a marketplace that's pretty crowded with gins, there has to be something of the identity of the maker or the place in which it's made to differentiate it. Hopefully not something that's so like radically weird that it doesn't taste anything like a gin. Yeah. But okay, that makes sense. Are there any kind of hard and fast rules though, like the commandments of how to make a gin, things that you have to stick by? Like, I don't know whether it's where you get the juniper from, or it's the ratio of juniper to other botanicals, or it could be the way in which the stills are run. Like, you have to do it this way, you can't do it that way, kind of thing.
Yeah, I suppose there's a few little rules, but not really. I mean, that's one of the beauties of gin, is that you can play all sorts of tunes with it. But if somebody says to me, look, I want a fairly traditional London dry gin, then you just write down juniper, coriander, angelica root, and those are the first three things you write down. Everything else you add is what sets it apart from all the others.
Yeah.
And the ratio of that holy trinity, if you like, is going to be different for different products as well. So if somebody wants something that's really juniper forward, then you just increase the amount of juniper and if they want it to be less juniper forward, then you might actually keep the juniper the same and increase some of the other things. It's it's not as simple as just moving things up and down. They all should act and react together. And the more different recipes you do, the more you understand how these different botanicals work together. So very often I'll have people come to me and say, look, this is something that's a bit unique for my area, so can we incorporate that into the product? Yeah, of course we can. It's not a problem at all. Usually I'll check it's not poisonous and all this sort of stuff first. But sometimes it just doesn't work. So without naming names, I did a recipe and they really wanted this one particular ingredient in it, and it was just horrible. It just didn't taste nice at all. So it's still in the product, but it's in there at a tiny, tiny amount.
Right.
So you can still tell the story that it's this local product that's growing, but actually,
and you test that on a micro-distillation.
Yeah.
As a single botanical, and then try it. Or do you test it with other botanicals as a sort of?
Yeah, it depends really. Sometimes what often I'll do is just throw it in with the other things. Sorry, that sounds wrong. I'll carefully weigh it and measure it and add it very accurately.
It's thrown in very carefully.
But I throw in an exact amount.
Yes, exactly. You're just good at basketball.
Yeah. And I'll just see how it works. And if that works all right, then you start tweaking the rest of the recipe and try and get it to be harmonious. Because the secret of a good gin is that it should be greater than the sum of its parts. All the ingredients should work together. Nothing should really stand out too much unless you want it to, or unless it's juniper, of course, which should be the predominant flavor. But yeah, everything should be nicely balanced, and that's not always easy to get.
You done any single, like just juniper gins?
Yeah, we did one at Chase. So we launched it as a single botanical gin, and that was on the front label. And then if you turn the bottle down, there was a rear label, and it was juniper flavoured vodka.
I do remember this now. Yeah. Because I've tried it a few times, like as a sort of distillate sample. And I think, is it Gin de Mahon? I think that's only juniper, the Menorcan one. And it's pretty damn good. It tastes quite nice. You're like, I wonder if we actually need the rest of this stuff,
Yeah, and it's interesting where it comes from. It was Master Malt, didn't they did that range of, what do they call it, origins or something like that?
Yeah, they did.
And they just used juniper from different
yes.
places around the world. And what was really nice about that is that you got the big 70 centilitre bottle with just that one juniper in, and then they had a little bottle of all the other botanicals, which you theoretically are supposed to add afterwards.
That's it.
But it was nice to just keep all those as to show the difference from juniper from different places.
Yeah.
So this Indian gin that I developed uses juniper from the slopes of the Himalayas, and it's 4 times the size of a Macedonian or juniper berry. It's absolutely huge and packed full of flavour. So the ratios had to be very, very different for that product.
Interesting. What about ratio of botanicals to spirit? Do you tend to keep a sort of rough sort of rule on that, or does it vary between product to product?
Yeah, so I always like my gins to be quite bold and quite strongly flavoured, not quite in your face. But there is a limit as to how much you can put in. If you put too heavy a weight of botanicals in, then the oil content, because the alcohol loves the oils and can dissolve the oils quite happily. But when you dilute that, maybe shaking a martini or adding tonic water to it, then actually, because alcohol likes water even more, there's not then enough alcohol left to keep these oils in suspension, and your gin can go cloudy. It louches. Now, there are some products that are designed to louche, like absinthe, of course, and they tend to be really, really heavy in botanicals. So there is a limit as to how much weight you can put into your gin. But it's not as simple as saying weight, because of course it depends on the ratio of the botanicals within that weight.
And the oil content of the juniper itself.
Of each of those ingredients, yeah, exactly.
And the other ingredients, sure. Yeah. So you have to actually be sympathetic to the specific ingredients you're using to kind of work that out, and then maybe suffer some trial and error in the process as well.
Yeah. And so that's scaling up from the very small micro benchtop scale up to the commercial size still. That's where a lot of people go wrong, because it's not a straight line.
No. Yeah. Can you drill into that a little bit more? Because it would. I think on the face of it, it would seem like, right, I've got a still that's, let's for argument's sake, it's 1/10 of the size. It's probably smaller than that. I'm going to use 1/10 the amount of spirit, 1/10 the amount of botanicals. Why doesn't that translate?
Well, I always tend to look at things in a very simplistic way, and for me, if you're using a mini still, you can do a batch in 20 minutes, and if you then allow it to cool down and pick up some of the juniper berries and taste them, there's still a lot of flavour left in them because it's such a short boiling time.
Yeah.
When you do it on a commercial basis, it might take 8 hours. And if you taste some of the juniper berries at the end of that process, all the flavour's gone. It's been extracted much, much more efficiently. So on the small scale, because of the time constraints, really, I think you have to overdose on juniper and 1 or 2 of the other botanicals. And that comes with experience.
Yeah.
And then the converse side of that, of course, is when you're scaling up from the recipe that you've perfected on this very small mini still, you then have to scale back on the juniper.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess the other way of doing it is you could grind the botanicals down to the correct scale as well, so that your juniper berries should be 1/10 of the size, so that you speed up the extraction.
I try and avoid doing that because depending on what you use to grind it, you lose some of the oils in your pestle and mortar or your grinder or whatever. It's difficult to get all those oils then into the still, and so you're adding a little bit of variation in at that stage as well.
Yeah.
But it is difficult when you do it on a very small scale because I've got a set of drug dealer scales that weigh to 1/100th of a gram, and when you're trying to throw in whole coriander seeds or juniper berries or whatever, then trying to get it to 0.01 of a gram.
Yeah.
And it's
Can you be found like trying to cut a coriander seed in half?
well, try and find the right sized ones.
Oh, just get sneaky. I like that. Yeah. And then, so just another variable that sort of springs to mind is the strength of the spirit as it goes into the still. Is that something that you tweak, or do you have a pretty standard strength?
I must admit, it's something I'd like to play around with a little bit more. So, we've installed.
And just to reiterate, of course, the vast majority of distilleries are just buying in neutral spirit.
Yeah.
That arrives at like 96% ABV, does it?
Yeah, it does. And a few distilleries then get problems from the local fire officer because the flash point in neutral spirit is, I think, 15.5 degrees centigrade. And even here in the summer, it's hotter than that sometimes. So it's dangerous stuff, and you need to treat it with a lot of respect. And we've had some nasty accidents, particularly in small craft distilleries where they've been unaware of some of these risks. But I don't want to be too downbeat about it. If you handle it with respect, then
definitely
you're okay.
Make sure you build a craft distillery and give Jamie a call.
Yeah, exactly. You need to know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So it would be delivered at 96%. And some people are then instructed by the fire, or have got round the problem with that, of diluting it as soon as it arrives. So if you're using quite a traditional copper still, then it's traditional to charge your still at roughly 50% ABV. Some people will do it a little bit higher, some people maybe a little bit less, but round about 50% is quite typical. And if you're getting your alcohol delivered at 96% in an IBC, it's quite nice because it's easy. You just attach a pipe to an empty one and open the valves, and it equalizes. You just top them up with water, and there you are, roughly 50%. But I've also done a lot of work with another still manufacturer called Genio G-Still. I don't know if you've come across those. Actually, that Avaldor Cornish potato vodka is made using their stills.
Italian?
No, they're Polish.
Oh, okay.
Originally. And they're really clever. They can make neutral spirit, 96% ABV spirit, and the very low levels of impurities that you're allowed in neutral spirits at a fraction of the capital outlay that we've had to spend up to a decade ago. But you can use these things for making gin as well. But it's just a quirk of those stills that you can only fill up to 35% ABV. So by default, I've been doing quite a lot of gins using those stills at a different ABV, and I'm not picking up much of a difference if I'm honest. But there's definitely more work to be done on that. One of the nice things is that I've been going to America once a year to teach American distillers how to make gin, together with 2 or 3 American distillers, and Marcel Thompson comes over from Australia and New Zealand as well. And the course is organised.
Who's Marcel Thompson?
Sorry, he does effectively what I do, but in Australia and New Zealand. And he's written a couple of very good books, which I'll give him a plug for. Certainly the first one, Still Magic, which is again a nice title. Mm-hmm. And he's got some of these, he calls them the golden ratios of some of the botanicals. But I don't think it's quite as simplistic as that. but they're certainly a really good starting point. So if somebody's looking to get into gin for the first time and don't really know what they're doing, if they can't afford me, then buy Marcel's book. But anyway, the course is run by Gary Spedding, who's originally from Burnley, but he's lived in America for a long time, and he has an analytical laboratory, and he does lots of work. Firstly, for the brewing industry, but in recent times, an awful lot for the distilling industry as well. And both he and somebody who works with him, Tony, have really got excited about gin. And they've got all this wonderful equipment, and you'll just put a little suggestion into his mind, and he'll run it through
Just test
to see what's happening. So things like the starting ABV of the spirit, things like, I know he's got a particular bee in his bonnet about gin changing as soon as you open the bottle, and even once it's been sat in the bottle in an unopened bottle for a couple of years. So he's now doing all sorts of horrible things to bottles of gin, like putting it under ultraviolet light for 48 hours and heating it in a rotovap, and then doing analysis on it. And he's finding the botanical profiles change quite dramatically. And we're hoping we can get somewhere where you can actually find out what botanicals are in a gin using some of his equipment. Not quite there yet.
What can you say about the distillation itself in terms of how the still is operated and how that might affect the character of the gin?
So, I mean, some of the way you run the still is set, it's fixed. You know, if you've got a simple pot still, then actually pretty much the only thing you can change, you can change the ABV of the charge. You can obviously, if it's gin, you can change the weight of and ratio of different botanicals. But the only other thing you can really change is the rate that you run it at. And that does have an effect on the product as well. If you run it a bit slower, it tends to come out a little bit smoother. Not always the case, but it tends to, particularly if you've got a lot of copper contact, so it increases the amount of time the spirit is in contact with the copper.
Do you think that's the reason it comes out smoother? But are you saying that even without the copper, it would come out smoother?
There's plenty of very good gins made on stainless steel.
So what do you think's happening there exactly?
Well, so the copper really helps. So firstly, it's for a metal, it's really reactive. So it helps removing some of the impurities, particularly things like sulfites. So copper loves sulfur and will react to form copper sulfate. And copper sulfate is not very soluble in alcohol, but is very, very soluble in water. So that tends to stay in the water fraction, so therefore never really leaves the still. So it removes some of the impurities that are rich in sulfites, and those can make the alcohol a little bit harsh. And some of them are created in fermentation, and some of them, they might be added. In fact, if you're buying cider from somebody to redistill, or a wine, then there might be low levels of sulfites in there added as a preservative into the cider. Well, that can be a problem for a distiller because it comes across at roughly the same temperature as the alcohol does. So copper really helps with
although of course sometimes desirable in whiskey. There's a few whiskey distilleries that trade off it because it does. Whiskey distilleries with worm tubs, particularly because there's less copper contact in the condensation. And then it turns out when you put these whiskies in barrels for a few years, they just get really interesting and meaty and fun.
That's another one of Gary's pet areas where he's working at the moment. He loves what goes on inside these barrel engines, as he calls them. Brilliant. And the truth is, we don't really know. There's so many chemical reactions going on in there. It's impossible to follow.
Well, yeah, interactive, extractive, and infusions as well. Yeah, it's there's a lot.
Yeah, so we know the basic principles, but then once a new chemical gets created effectively inside the barrel and inside the cask, then it reacts with all the other things that are being created at the same time. So it goes off in all sorts.
Chain reactions,
potentially. Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah,
I've got so much time for the blenders. That's an astonishing thing to be able to do.
On scale, when you've got all these different distilleries making different things, and it's like, oh no, you can only have this much this year, and oh no, but it's got 12 written on the bottle. It's got to be 12 years old. And it doesn't taste right. Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? Yeah.
There's not much you can do with a simple pot still. A lot of the stills that we've been installing in the UK are, some people call them hybrid stills.
Yes.
And they have very often a little short column alongside it with a small number of bubble plates in. And you can play some tunes with that. And a couple of the German manufacturers, Holstein and Christian Karl, you can just throw a lever and bring these plates in and out of operation. And that's quite interesting.
Because that just creates some further copper contact in like kind of reflux.
Yeah, more reflux as well, yeah.
So you're getting sort of just my explanation of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, it basically just prevents the vapor from traveling up and over too soon. It sort of forces it back down. There's almost like a miniature condensation taking place there before it goes back up. And so you've got the sustained contact with the copper.
Exactly. And you've seen that in the whiskey stills. So somewhere like Glenmorangie, they've got these huge, great tall helmets on their stills. Whereas, I don't know, Chichibu in Japan, they've got really stumpy a helmet. And so at Glenmorangie, they get much more reflux condensation, so they get a higher ABV coming off the still, and it's a lighter, more floral style of whiskey. The Chichibu is heavier and perhaps a little bit more complex, but they're both fantastic whiskies. I absolutely love them both. I'm a huge fan of Chichibu, by the way.
Oh, well, I mean, Chichibu might be the best whiskey distillery on the planet. It's
as a Scotsman,
amazing.
I might agree with you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's hard to argue with it. You've visited it. It's incredible. I went there when I was doing the whiskey book, and the tasting room there is just incredible because you're like, there's a lot of really tasty whiskey here. How you're like doing the maths in your head. How am I going to get through all of this stuff? You know.
And I love the way. I mean, the staff were about 20. I think the average age was 21 or something
really young.
like that. It's so keen and enthusiastic.
Yeah.
Oh, it was a beautiful place.
It's amazing. Yeah.
So yeah, obviously they're still, and they're also made out of copper, and copper has got really, really good heat transfer properties. So if you've got a tall, slender neck and it's radiating heat, you're going to get more of the vapor inside it condensing back into a liquid, flowing back down by gravity into the pot where it gets reboiled. And the more reflex condensation you get, the sort of purer the alcohol becomes, the higher ABV certainly it becomes. And these bubble plates are a way of increasing that much more efficiently, the reflux, and I suppose more controllably as well. And that was the big change in the 1830s when the coffee still was developed, and vodka and neutral spirits and gin and even whiskey changed at that time. And again, we forget how very, very different the products would have been at that time.
Yeah, anything before then that was called vodka or gin would not have been the sort of vodka and gin that we know of now. And even unaged rums and things like that, Cuban style rum did not exist because they required column stills as well. And of course, grain whiskey as well for whiskey and blending whiskey. Just picking up on a point, just going back slightly. So we were talking about the rate at which you run the still. And you mentioned that running it faster maybe makes it slightly more sort of harsher. Mm-hmm. I don't think that was your exact words, but I'm going to use them. And the benefit of copper. But let's say I've got a steel still and I run it fast or slow, let's say I run it slowly, and you're saying it produces a slightly smoother spirit. What do you think is happening there? Is it something to do with sort of vapor pressure precipitating more sort of like heavier alcohols over?
Yeah. And also, if we're still talking about gin, then there are things you can do within your botanical recipe. There are some botanicals which help contribute to both the mouthfeel, which can help make a gin taste a little bit smoother, but also some that seem to just react with the other botanicals and just give you a slightly smoother flavour. So there are obvious ones like licorice root, because glyceric acid is something like 200 times sweeter than sucrose. And whereas sucrose doesn't distill across, this glyceric acid does. I'm not sure that's how it's pronounced, by the way. There are too many Z's and so on in there for me. I can't spell it, certainly. But anyway, some of the sweetness does come across from the licorice, and this sweetness tends to mask some of the flavors and some of the unpleasant flavors and some of the harsh flavors. And so licorice is always a good ingredient to include to make a smoother gin. I think chamomile is another one, and that's often said to have similar sorts of properties, not because of sweetness, but it's a nice ingredient.
Yeah, I mean, it's got that calming kind of property to it. Yeah. I guess that helps in the flavor profile of a gin.
So if you haven't got copper, and then you're making gin, then you can play around with the botanicals a little bit to help. But if you've got copper, you can still play those same tunes with the botanicals and make it even smoother.
Yeah. What is that to say about cutting the spirit? It always sort of strikes me that if you've got this sort of neutral spirit without anything dangerous in it, then barring using poisonous ingredients, you're not going to have anything dangerous come out of the other end. So what's the sort of rationale behind really needing to make a first cut of the spirit?
Yeah, to be honest, the first cut, the heads cut, or the feints, whatever you want to call it. There are
4 shots.
4 shots, yeah. if you bought neutral spirit from a good reputable source, then actually there's no need. So really you discard a tiny portion, and that's really just to clear the dregs of what's remaining in the pipework from the previous run, which effectively is the tails from the previous run. And so it's tiny cuts when you're making gin, as long as your neutral spirit is good enough.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the neutral spirit has improved dramatically in the last 20 years as well.
Has it?
Yeah, it's fantastic nowadays.
Why is that, do you think? Just demand from all these small distilleries? Or in technological improvements?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is driven by legislation, of course, because in Europe, neutral spirits and is allowed, I think, from memory, 50 milligrams of methanol, for example, per hectolitre of pure alcohol, whereas vodka is allowed just 10. So, because people have always said to me when we were making Chase, why don't you just buy neutral spirit and dilute it with water and stick in a bottle? But actually, it doesn't meet those legislative requirements because of the levels of impurities. And certainly, when I looked at this, when you look at the specification for neutral spirit at the time, then it was always 50 milligrams. And if you asked for a certificate of analysis, there would be a fair amount of methanol in there. Whereas nowadays, if you buy neutral spirit and get a certificate of analysis for methanol, it's just not detected. And so it's being distilled better at these huge industrial plants that are making it nowadays.
So all of that neutral spirit at that time would have had to have been redistilled, even if it was going to be bottled as vodka.
I wouldn't say all of it necessarily, but yeah, a lot of it wouldn't. If you just bottled it as vodka, it wouldn't necessarily have met the legal requirements.
Interesting.
And I think London Dry Gin, I think, is even tighter. I think it's 5 milligrams of methanol. Anyway, thankfully we don't have to worry about that too much now, unless you're making your own base spirit from scratch.
Yeah. So is there anything else to say about distillation? What about, so I guess on the other thing on the sort of cuts is, do you find that certain botanicals manifest themselves more or less during the course of the spirit run? And so stylistically, there may be a reason to cut later on that first cut. Obviously, you're throwing away alcohol, or later or earlier on the end cut.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. So, yeah, if you think of a typical gin recipe, you might have 10 or 12 different botanicals in there. And the thing that gives the gin the flavour is the oils that are in each one of those botanicals. And each one of those oils are different. They each have their own different boiling points as well. So if you were to charge your still at 50% ABV, having diluted your neutral spirit down, and bring it up to the boil, obviously, almost by definition, the way the still works is it's extracting and concentrating that alcohol. It doesn't come out at 100% ABV, but it might come out at, let's say, 85% ABV. And that's obviously stronger than the charge that you put into the pot. So as you go through the run, the ABV of the alcohol that's left in the pot slowly falls. Now, the boiling point of that mixture is related to the strength of the alcohol in the pot as well. So the boiling, as the ABV falls throughout the run, the temperature is boiling at increases. And that then means that all these different oils in the botanicals come across at different times. So you tend to get a lot of the very light citrus flavors coming off right at the very start. That's why you don't want to make a big head cut. I love citrus in my gin. Then you tend to get juniper. Then you get sort of spiciness from things like coriander seed, and towards the end you get more of the sort of earthy, woody notes from depending on what botanicals you've chosen. Now, there's not a sudden cut off from one to the other. They gradually blend into each other. So yeah, making the cut at the same point each time is critical if you want to make a consistent product, because if you follow what I've just said, if you cut very, very early, then you'll lose some of those earthy notes, which might not be particularly nice actually on their own, but when they're blended and mixed in with all the others, they help contribute to the complexity of the gin. And that's also the reason why you then have to make a tails cut at some stage, because eventually these flavors become actually really unpleasant and quite strong, and they start to taste like overstewed tea. And these are the more water soluble flavors rather than the more water soluble flavors rather than the alcohol soluble flavors that are coming across early on. So that's the reason that you'd make a tail cut. And there's still quite a lot of alcohol in there as well. So you don't want to lose that. So you can rework.
What sort of strength would that tend to happen at as a sort of ballpark?
So it depends on the design of the still. So if you're running it up one of these hybrid side columns, for example, then you might cut at 83% ABV. But if it's just a simple pot without a side column, then it might be 65% ABV. So it does depend on the design.
For the tails.
For the tails, yeah. When you cut from hearts to tails,
right.
And then I always say to people, just keep running and extract all the other alcohol. Speed up the process then, because you're not interested in the quality. You just want to get all the rest of the alcohol out.
Yeah.
And then what I like to do is just incorporate that into the next run, because those tails won't come across until after that same temperature has been reached inside the pot.
Yeah, sure.
So as long as you keep making your cut in the same place, they never come across. They never build up.
Right, so that's higher than I would have thought.
It depends on the still,
Yeah.
but it is pretty high, and so and you think, because you're buying neutral spirit, and obviously the impurities have been pretty much removed when you first start, that actually there's no need to make a tails cut at all. But it's all to do with the flavour of the gin. It's not to do with the level of impurities.
Sure. What do you think about gin bottling strength? I always think it's an interesting one. It's like every brand has to have its own strength, and probably we've run out of decimal options now, so there must be some repetitions out there in the marketplace, and of course some brands are changing, not pointing any fingers, Tanqueray. It's such a weird one, because of all the spirits, it's kind of the most pointless to have as precise bottling strength, because gin is always mixed, right? I mean, very few people, apart from people making gin or people going to gin distilleries or doing gin masterclasses, ever get around to tasting gin neat. It's always diluted down either in a cocktail or in a gin and tonic.
I do so half agree with that. I mean, when I had Burley's gin, we had 3 products, and they were all variations on a theme. Effectively, they all had the same 12 botanicals, I think it was. I can't quite remember. I've got it written down, obviously. But they all had the same botanicals in. But 2 of the products were exactly the same, just at different strengths.
I've still got a bottle of your strong one, I think, unopened.
Well, there's the Distiller's Cut, which was the other one. Then that had a slightly different ratio of botanicals, and as the name suggests, that was my favourite one. But it was quite interesting using the export strength of 47% ABV compared to exactly the same product, but bottled at 40% ABV. The flavours were very different. And I take your point that people don't drink gin neat in the main, but even in a martini, the flavour difference was still there.
Yeah, but they were what was the difference in strength? 7%.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty significant difference. And so in a martini, you're going to end up, once you've had the dilution of vermouth, they're going to be still 5% difference probably. So definitely, undeniably different. It's when it gets down to decimals where I'm a bit like, come on.
No, I agree. And so that's where I do 100% agree with you. There has to be a really, really good reason to move away. Well, actually, I say that. I wouldn't bottle less than 40% ABV.
Sure.
The legal minimum is 37.5. But people, if you're paying, because you do small volumes as a craft distiller, you have to work on larger margins than the big boys have to. And so people need to have a reason to pay that extra money, and frankly, if you drop below 40, then one of those reasons disappears. And some of that might be snobbery and so on, but actually I'm a snob, obviously. I'd go along with that as well. So 40% would be my standard. And then I always say, particularly in the UK where duty rates are quite high, there has to be a good reason to move to a higher strength. Because the amount of duty you pay is directly related to the amount of alcohol in the bottle. And if you put it up to just 43% ABV, which doesn't sound a huge difference, although it is, I mean, it's nearly 10%, then the duty increases by 10% as well. And people say, but the duties, that's only 50p a bottle or whatever it is. But by the time the wholesalers put their margin on, the retailers put their margin on, and the bars put their margin on, that 50p is all of a sudden 3 or 4 quid a bottle.
And that makes a difference.
Yeah. And one of the things I've learned, and that's from building so many distilleries and brands with people, is that a lot of everybody gets fixated on the product and the way the bottle looks and that sort of thing. Whereas what they should be concentrating on is how they're going to sell the products and how they're going to market the products. And the costings of that is obviously really, really key to the whole thing as well. that's by far and away the hardest thing to do. You know, if with my help, people can make a nice product, I think, and if they put their mind to it, they can make a nice looking bottle as well. But that should be taken as read.
Yeah.
If your liquid's no good, then you don't stand a chance.
Yeah, I mean, I guess kind of making a nice looking product and a nice tasting product is step one of the marketing, isn't it? But it really is only step one. And like you say, what's the point in even beginning it unless you know you're going to nail those?
Yeah.
So then it's time to start thinking about how you're actually going to get this thing into bars, into shops.
Yeah.
What your route to market, your brand agency, your PR, your marketing plan, all of that.
Yeah. And so when people are building their distillery, they need to have at least the same amount of money again for the branding and the marketing and the way they launch the product.
Yeah.
You only get one chance to launch the product.
And that's for gin. If you're talking about an aged product, then you need to the same again and again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, how the economics of building a brand new whiskey distillery work out. Yeah, it's just...
Yeah. So let's talking about that was a fantastic sort of quick masterclass in gin, by the way. Thank you for that. So talking about building distilleries, and you've done so many. Possibly more than anyone in the world.
I haven't even thought.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I'm sure there must be.
I mean, anyone in the UK for sure, and I mean, you know, there could be a U knocking about in Europe, probably not, but in the US as well, it's possible. But I don't know. I've never come across anyone who's consulted on so many. So you are the man to talk to about the pitfalls of building a distillery, the kind of necessary requirements, the budgets, and any other sort of contributing factors that make these things successful. What's the success rate like on these at the moment? Are they all still going? Are there a few closed? I mean,
yeah, I mean it's some have closed, some many are still going. It's the whole of the industry has been through a tough time, obviously with particularly with COVID, but also. It's more difficult now to export your products as well into Europe. There are other markets further afield where it's just the same as it ever was, sort of thing. But it's for a craft distiller, it was quite easy to get your product into France and then to support that because you can hop on an EasyJet or a Ryanair, and other airlines are available obviously, but you can get out there relatively cheaply and help support your distributor. Whereas it's quite expensive to go out to Australia or Japan and do the same sort of thing. So yeah, a lot of craft distillers have sort of stopped exporting anywhere near as much. I always used to say to people that export should make up roughly a third of your business once you've been running about 2 or 3 years, and that's what what I used to achieve pretty much. But there you can't really make hard and fast rules like that. And building every distillery I've built has been completely different, and they've all had their challenges. So we did one in Manchester, for example, Manchester Three Rivers, which unfortunately I don't think is still going. Well, David's a good friend of mine, and he asked me to come up and I think see 3 different buildings before we found one that was suitable for use. Some of them were difficult to actually get the equipment into, but actually mostly it's because even once you're up and running, you still need to get quite a lot of heavy materials in, and once the bottles are filled, they're even heavier to get those out again. So we went to one where there was just a little lift going up and down into this beautiful area. I mean, if we'd done it, it would have looked absolutely stunning. But
unfortunately, the ones that look the best are often the ones where you're like, how did they do this? Yeah. How did they get all this in there?
There are some great ones there. I mean, Salcombe, not too far from you in Cornwall, Salcombe in Devon. Yeah. I mean, that's in a boathouse on the creek, and that's just a stunning location. You can sail your yacht and moor it outside and go in for a gin and tonic. And they've launched that brilliant service, haven't they, where for an extortionate fee you can call them up and they'll come out in their rib with a sort of dressed as a butler with a bottle of gin on a silver platter or something.
Very Salcombe indeed. Yeah.
But it's a lovely, lovely location. And as part of the getting planning permission, I think they had to put a lift in for disabled access and so on. But that then became really useful for putting materials up and down into the place as well.
So besides sort of accessibility and, like you say, heavy equipment, what else? I mean, services, I would think, like disposal of waste materials and water supply and electric would be pretty high up the list, right?
Yeah, so again, it depends really on what product you're going to make. quite a lot of if, again, back to gin, it's really quite simple. And whereas in the good old days, you would have a still and you'd have a separate boiler and you generate steam and use the steam to heat it. A lot of the stills we put in the last decade or so have been almost sort of plug and play. So the heating is built into it. I really like the water jackets that they have, and the heater elements sit inside the water jacket, so they heat the water, and in turn that heats the alcohol that's in the still, and that works really, really nicely. They're then 100% electric, so you don't have to worry about oil and gas, and they work really nicely, and they're easy to move as well if you ever have to move them around. And nowadays, if you can get green electricity, and the whole country is moving more and more that way, then it becomes a really good eco choice as well. But you're limited in terms of size and scale, so they work really well for gin, where you get a big, because you're starting at a high ABV, and you get a relatively big number of bottles from a relatively small still. It works brilliantly for gin, but it's no good.
If you're fermenting a low strength like wine or beer, then you need bigger stills.
Exactly. Yeah. And then it becomes, because the surface area of the pot increased by a factor of a square as the stills get bigger.
Yeah.
But the volume of the alcohol in there increases by a factor of a cube. So eventually you can't physically fit enough heater elements in to do a big still.
Got you. There really is like an actual physical limit on the size.
Yeah, it is. It's just physically fitting those elements in.
Yeah.
So when I built Chase, we weren't on the gas main. So we had to do that on oil, and when we got really busy, I mean, it was like a military operation trying to get enough oil into the place. It was quite something, especially since the bloody farmhands used to nick it for the tractors.
Oh, that's the stories of a farm distillery that you want to hear, though. Like, they wanted to run the tractor off it. We couldn't put the still on today. I mean, what else? What are any other sort of pitfalls someone might encounter who wasn't soliciting you for your services in setting up a distillery? What are some common mistakes, you think, or things that unexpected things that people just don't?
Yeah, access is one we've touched on, and people never think about that. You've got to have good services, so you need a big electricity supply or gas or oil if needs be. You obviously need a good clean water supply and need lots of it. You need to think very carefully about how you're going to get rid of waste products. That's often the biggest headache for a distillery. Not really an issue for gin, but we had loads of waste when we were making the potato vodka, but we were on a farm. We had a license that allowed us to put the waste on the fields, and the cows used to come and eat it. And there was still a bit of alcohol left in it as well, I think, so these cattle were sort of ready marinated to be.
Oh yeah, I've heard. I know breweries sometimes donate the off beer to cows because it sort of keeps them nice and supple, and it sort of tenderizes the meat while they're still wandering around wearing it.
Isn't the Wagyu beef?
They're obviously big and fat, lots of fat veins and everything. But Sharp's Brewery, I used to go in and taste beer every single week, because when they were making Doom Bar, literally during the sort of 3 or 4 years that I did this tasting panel, they went from making 6 batches a week to like 24. Not only that, every batch was like 4x bigger, because this was during their massive expansion phase. So we'd go in and we'd taste all the beers, and we'd sort of score them for like trueness to type and just all full sort of organoleptic assessment. But yeah, they used to say, because it's Cornwall, so there's lots of farms, if the beer was off, it went to the cows. And I don't know, maybe it's urban myth, but like the cows obviously loved it. They've got a very high tolerance of alcohol because they're massive, and the farmers are happy because allegedly it makes for better beef.
Yeah, I think for the big boys, you can sell sometimes your waste, but for the craft distillery, the best you can hope for is somebody will come and take it away for free. As a Scotsman, it pains me to pay for somebody to say waste product.
Oh yeah,
I don't like it at all. So waste can be a problem. Depends on the product you're making and obviously where you're situated. If you try and build a whiskey distillery in the middle of the bottom of Fleet Street, then it's going to be a bit more difficult than a gin distillery, for example. Although the guys at East London Liquor Company are making some decent whiskey.
Yeah. It's coming along really well. Yeah, sure.
And then we've already touched on the route to market and how to sell product. I have to say that's not my area of expertise. So when I have built my own distilleries for myself, I've always collaborated with somebody else, because and he's looked after the sales while I've looked after the operation side.
The budgeting for this kind of thing is fairly clear now. Like, you're able to kind of give. There's usually nothing unexpected
No, but that's the other mistake that people often make, is to get the scale wrong in the first place. Because once you've bought a still and installed it, it's actually quite difficult to make it bigger, other than just by buying more stills. And if you've crammed it into a small space, all of a sudden you've got nowhere to install these extra ones. And anyway, you've got the expense of buying extra ones as well. And the difference in cost between, let's say, a 150 litre still and a 500 litre still actually isn't that great. So if you can afford it without stretching your finances too much, then I always say to people, go for the bigger one. And that might mean you're only distilling one day every 3 weeks, but it doesn't matter, because that means you're out there going to see bartenders, going to see your distributors and your wholesalers and so on,
because do other things.
They all want to meet the person who's making the product, or the person who owns the business. And on a small craft scale, that's often the same person, of course.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. It makes so much sense. I think possibly, like with any kind of entrepreneurial endeavor, people have this sort of rose-tinted idea of like, I'm going to be crafting this thing every single day. It's like, well, cool, then who's selling your product?
Exactly, yeah. Especially since so many craft distilleries are sort of one-man bands, or a couple, for example. And it's great because, again, particularly for gin, you can do it on a really small scale, and almost like a hobby business. And people have grown from that to make a really nice little business out of it, growing organically without risking too much. And I think it's become a bit more difficult in recent times. So the middle size distilleries, and there were quite a lot of them, I think they're the ones who are finding it much more difficult now. So the very small ones are doing all right. The bigger ones who've now got that scale. So I mean, obviously Sipsmith, but the likes of Warner Edwards and Salcombe that we mentioned, East London Liquor Company, yeah, they're finding it a bit easier, I think, than some of the mid-sized ones. But it is tough. It is tough. And so the scale of operation, very often people get that quite badly wrong, and they think, well, okay, if I've got this still and I'm making whiskey, then I'm making gin rather, then I can make whiskey on it. And of course it's possible, but you can't really do it commercially, because the ABV of what you're filling the still in is so very, very different that you don't get a commercial quantity out of it if you're trying to make the whiskey from an 8% wash rather than a gin charge at 50% ABV.
Yeah, sure. Would you tend to install a gin still, and then that would be used as a spirit still, and then an additional larger still as the wash still in a distillery that wants to make gin and whiskey?
Yeah, we've done that quite a lot. So they started off with just one still, and that's made all their whiskey in small quantities and too much gin, frankly. But then when they're ready for the whiskey and they can afford it, then they put in a bigger wash still, and then that still becomes perfectly sized for the spirit run of the whiskey.
Yeah, got it.
And again, you can still run the gin through, but if you're only running it once every 3 weeks, then that's perfect, because that leaves the time to do the whiskey.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, make a pilot high and make it less often, kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. It doesn't go off.
How do you...
Unless you talk to Gary and Tony in America.
Yeah, we might return to that in a few years once he's finished his experiments. How do you sort of view the next 10 years for craft distilling in the UK and elsewhere, if you choose to sort of include that as well? It feels like gin has lost some of its luster. I think probably in efforts to sort of, for all the new brands to diversify, it's become confusing for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got the flavoured gin side of it, where it's sweetened and fruit flavoured, and it seems like it's appealing to people who buy vapes and sort of horrendous soft drinks and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Not kind of necessarily lambasting every single flavoured gin person. I guess it does have a place, but nevertheless, it doesn't feel like it's doing any great favours for gin as a category, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's this generation's version of the alcopops.
Yeah,
we used to buy Hooch and all that sort of stuff.
Flavoured cider as well fits into the same category. Yeah. So I mean, how do you feel like that's affected the reputation of gin, and what do you think that means for the next? I mean, obviously, like you say, you're doing rum distilleries and whiskey and all sorts of other stuff as well, but gin has been largely your bread and butter.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the next 5 or 10 years for it?
Gin's been very, very kind to me. So I don't knock it. It's I mean, you look at brands like Malfi, and they've taken the category to places where well, I say they didn't exist. They did exist. I got some old... When you opened the City of London Distillery, Jonathan went on eBay and bought old empty bottles. And we had some things like Gordon's ginger-flavoured gin and lemon-flavoured gin.
Has happened before?
From the 30s or 20s.
Yeah.
I can remember the days. But they were quite old. So, we're sort of reinventing it. But you look at Malfi, they've done fantastically well. They're doing... not far off 2 million bottles a year now. That's a huge product. And okay, they've got a traditional sort of gin in their portfolio, but the bulk of what they sell is particularly the citrus flavored ones, and actually they're quite good fun. Then there are a lot of people more snobbish than me who would say they're not gin, but they've got their place, and I think it helps the category. But I am a bit of a traditionalist. I like to taste juniper in my gin. I like a gin and tonic, and I like a good gin martini. I think those are two of the best drinks that have ever been created. And I find as I'm getting older and crotchety that I'm drinking more and more drinks that actually come straight from the bottle and aren't diluted. And I'm sorry to say this in front of one of my favourite cocktail bartenders, but I start drinking Schnapps, and proper. I'm not talking Archers. I'm talking proper, because as well as being a proud Scotsman, I'm half Austrian as well. My mother was Austrian, and
oh right, so you've got some sort of Schnapps distilling pedigree kind of in your blood.
Exactly,
yeah. That's that and Scotland combined. I mean, you've really landed in the right profession. I think.
Exactly, yeah. So I've got a cousin in Austria, and he every year he distills. Quetchen, which is like a plum schnapps from the plums that grow in his garden, and it's getting better. But in Austria, you're allowed to distill a small quantity for your own personal use, and that's lovely. I did some work in Montenegro last year and bought a couple of bottles of rakia back with me. And when I was in China as well last time, we had a rakia masterclass from a load of Bulgarians, and I mean, their products were fantastic, but their masterclass was just hilarious, because they put up this slide of the legal issues surrounding rakia, and the first line on this slide was, "There are no."
I love it.
We just ignore the laws. We do what we want.
Brilliant. Bulgarians. I think they have the highest alcohol consumption per capita. Bulgarians.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, if I lived there, some of those schnapps were absolutely beautiful. He brought a lovely quince one and a beautiful pear one out to China with him.
It's interesting to get your take. I feel like eau de vie is possibly kind of the hardest thing to nail, and when it is done, it's the most incredible expression of what distillation can achieve.
I love eau de vie.
Yeah.
I absolutely adore it. And you're right. I mean, I'm a huge fan of whiskey as well, but as a distiller, a lot of the character of the whiskey obviously comes from the cask, and what happens to it after it's left the distiller's hands.
Yeah.
Whereas for an eau de vie, then that's far less true.
But I think kind of if you can make a fantastic whiskey with the sort of mentality of an eau de vie distiller by using the barley or corn or whatever it is you're distilling from as your fruit, let's say, and because I think this sort of the approach that eau de vie distillers take, both in terms of the ingredients they're using, the way they ferment them, and then the way that magically, somehow, after all of that, this thing comes off the still smelling like the perfect version of that particular fruit. If you can do that with barley, or if you can do it with sugarcane, or you can do it with, well, grapes is eau de vie as well, really, then that sets you up perfectly for the next step of maturation.
And there are plenty of eau de vie de bière and beer schnapps and so on, aren't there? All over Central and Eastern Europe as well. But I remember going to a distillery in Austria, and there were these green fruit crates piled up outside full of plums. And these things were just fermenting in the crates. And he said, "I've got to get these inside today, otherwise," he said they're just going to start running out of the bottom of these crates. But again, it's a very different setup. So that's why, when I first start talking to people about what distillery they want, it's really important that they have a firm idea of where they want to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And nobody has that idea, frankly. No. But at least they have to have some sort of inkling about it. Because when you go to a Schnapps or an eau de vie distillery in Austria or Germany or further east or France, you see lines of stills, and they'll have multiple stills, all reasonably small. And that's because all these bloody fruits come to ripen at the same time, and so you can't just have them sat and I'll do the apples today and the pears tomorrow, sort of in a month's time rather. You have to distill these as they ripen and get them at the peak of ripeness, and they all happen at the same time. So you might see 15 stills all lined up, and 5 of them are doing apricots, and 3 are doing plums, and 4 or 5 are doing apples and pears. It's fantastic.
I need to go do this. I've never been to any of these sort of Central European eau de vie places, but it sounds amazing. I only really. It's definitely a gap in my sort of distilling tours. that needs filling.
Well, they're products we don't really drink in
No,
this
well, this
country,
is the
isn't it?
thing.
It's such a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, they're sort of seen as these sort of quaint, slightly oddball European products, very sort of agricultural, but just delicious. Like when you taste the good ones. I mean, you've been to St. George in California.
Never been.
Because they started as an eau de vie distillery and they still produce a lot of eau de vies.
Yeah.
They're not as successful as the other products they're making, the gins and whiskies now and everything, which are also fantastic. And actually, by the way, when I sort of say like taking the sensibilities of an eau de vie producer and applying it to other spirits, I think that's exactly what they've done there. Yeah. But yeah, some of their stuff just phenomenal, you know, and it's just that clarity of expression of the base material. It's like witchcraft, really.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And getting that balance between getting a smooth spirit and a flavorful spirit where you can taste the fruit is brilliant.
Yeah.
We did one distillery. I think I've had to sign so many non-disclosure agreements that there's lots I can't talk about. But we did one, and I'm sure Will won't mind. Do you know the Green Sandwich Distillery? It's outside either Tunbridge or Tunbridge Wells. I always get them muddled up. But he's making gin and so on as well. But really, he started to make use of effectively wonky fruits.
Oh, yeah.
So there's lots of fruit packing houses in particularly in Kent, and he goes to get some of the ones which there's nothing wrong with them. Again, they're clean, they're sound, and they're wholesome. But he'll get those and he turns those into eau de vie. And he did one called which. So he was asking me about raspberries, and I love raspberry eau de vie. And for almost all of the eau de vie, the law in Europe is that the flavour has to come from the named fruit, and that named fruit has to be fermented. There are a few exceptions to that, and raspberries is one of them. And the reason for that is, although you can make a fantastic product by fermenting raspberries, and they're really sweet fruit, but actually there's not a lot of sugar in them. The reason they taste sweet is because there's not much acid in there as well. So although you can
strawberry is another one where there's not a great deal of sugar in there, really.
Exactly.
You know?
So you can ferment them, but you don't get very much alcohol out of them. So you could, and how was it described to me? This guy in Austria, he just said the product is beautiful, but the yield is catastrophically low.
So what do? They ferment it with other fruit? Or
So what they do is there is a sort of subgroup of eau de vie called in Germany it's a Geist, which means ghost. And effectively, you take raspberries and you would macerate them in neutral spirits, for example, or maybe a brandy.
Right.
And then you distill that.
Okay,
and
so it's like a gin.
Yeah,
really.
the ghost of the flavour.
Yeah. I mean, ghost, spirit, it's all kind of,
So when Will said, I've got these raspberries, what can I do with it? I described this process. And he's actually launched it as Raspberry Ghost rather than calling it the Geist because obviously he's in England.
I had a mango spirit in Mexico at a mezcal distillery. A sort of mango spirit in Europe seems like the most expensive thing you could possibly make, but of course when you've got mangoes everywhere, and they do get very sweet, you can. I should have brought some with me. Because he gave us some to take in a plastic water bottle, which I've still got at home. But yeah, remarkable. I mean, it's not the most refined, sort of cleanest expression of mango. Bear in mind, this is like natural ferment, open wooden fermentation vats, and then pretty small, pretty kind of basic stills as well.
Yeah.
Very little control, wood-fired, all that kind of thing. But nevertheless, undeniably mango. But that kind of slightly dirty, fermenty tropical mango thing, you know.
So Will, who we were just talking about in Kent, he did a mango one as well.
Oh, really?
And again, a bit incongruous because you wouldn't expect mangoes in
And expensive, like really expensive, but wonky fruit.
Apparently, when they're packing the mangoes, which they do in the pack houses in Kenya, they come over in bulk and they pack them into whatever the supermarkets require. Apparently, they have to cut open 1 in 50 to make sure it's sound, and those just get thrown into a bin. So all of a sudden, 1 fruit and 50 waste. Historically, now mango schnapps.
That's crazy.
It is, yeah.
That is crazy. 1 in 50 mangoes must be cut. It sounds almost like a religious observation.
Yeah. Well, I think they're half cut.
Oh God, like circumcision of a mango.
Yeah. Now, I might have got the numbers wrong, but nevertheless, a significant proportion of them need to be cut open.
That's so funny. Wow, that's good. So locate your distillery near a sort of wonky fruit or fruit sorting factory because they're bound out a load of stuff they want to get rid of.
But the thing is, you can ferment Yeah, anything with starch and sugar and you can ferment.
Yeah.
And I kicked myself for not doing it. And because I used to have a breakfast cereal company and it's just 20 miles along the road that way. And my old business partner still runs it. He's got loads of cereal waste, because we put the bran flakes and the wheat flakes and all this sort of stuff over sieves. And that just goes to waste. A pig farmer comes and picks
Like
it
the
up.
powder, basically.
Yeah.
Just, yeah.
So it's got all these grains in. They've already been gelatinized. There is some added sugar there as well. So I could, and it would be free. And so I could turn it into all sorts of huge quantities of alcohol. The only problem is what would you call it?
Well, yeah. But is that just maybe like a good justification for locating a neutral spirit plant next to a cereal plant, right? Because you can then just distill the shit out of it, and then you've got neutral spirit which you can sell on to whoever wants to buy it, right?
Well, I think it is a way of using up waste that people haven't really considered too much. I used to work in breakfast cereals. I worked for about 15 years in breakfast cereals, and Kellogg's Cornflakes have this flavour that no other cornflake has. And we didn't have any brands. We used to all own label products for the supermarkets, and they always wanted the same flavour as Kellogg's Cornflakes, and we didn't know how they did it. Now I do, and it's good because I work with fermentation a lot, and it just suddenly struck me because there's a big Kellogg's factory actually in Wrexham, again not far from here, as well as in Trafford Park. But it struck me when they're making cornflakes, it's very difficult to reincorporate the waste back into the product because it's not an amalgamated product. It's a piece of sweet corn that's been cooked and squashed effectively. And it suddenly struck me.
A cornflake is?
Yeah.
So each one is a piece of sweet corn?
Using that traditional method, yeah.
Is it really?
Yeah.
I always thought it was just a mash that was then kind of, I don't know, sort of cookie cut out and then fried or whatever.
So you can use extruders to use maize flour to make it, but those are the cheaper products.
Interesting. Wow, they should use that. Like each flake, a corn kernel or something, doesn't it? Maybe we need to work on this a little bit, but something along those lines. Anyway, sorry.
Well, Kellogg's have been doing it for 120 years or whatever.
I mean, they don't need any help with marketing, I don't think. They've done all right. Anyway, sorry, the rest of the story about how they make.
No, it just struck me that it's quite difficult to incorporate any waste, and you get
Yes.
lots of waste, just as said from sievings and so on. And the other unusual thing about Kellogg's, when you look at the ingredients list, they never declared malt extract, which every other breakfast cereal did. It was always malt flavouring. And I never quite knew what this malt flavouring was. Well, now I'm pretty certain they're just taking these sievings and adding malt extract to it with diastatic enzymes in there, converting that starch effectively back into sugar and using that as part or all of their sugar. Because you've got to remember, in America, they don't tend to use sugar. They use corn syrup an awful lot because it was difficult to get sugar into the middle of the
So they're using
country.
malt as their sweetening agent.
Yeah.
And that's why it's like turbo malty cornflake.
Yeah. And when you see, I mean, they were very secretive, but you see a couple of pictures every now and again from inside the factory, and they've got these huge, great mash tuns. I mean, that's definitely their mash tuns.
So, okay, right. So they're like halfway towards being a bourbon distillery, really.
Yeah. And sort of in those terms, but yeah.
Right. Speaking of, we've been talking about how wonderful eau de vie can be and sort of the expression of the base material and how delicious you can make a spirit, the potential of deliciousness in a spirit. You were in China last year. What were you doing there?
Yeah, so there
is a segue here to spirits because we're going to taste something in a minute. So tell me about China.
Yeah, this was my second visit to China, both for the same reason actually. Is I was honoured actually to be chosen as a judge for this spirits selection, which is run by the Concours Mondial de Bruxelles. So it's a spirits competition, and they get entrants from all around the world. And each year they hold the competition in a different country, and there's about 150 judges, and they're all experts in their field and me. And it's absolutely fantastic because these guys are so knowledgeable. And it must be horrible for anybody else, although few people bring their wives and
I
husbands
expect these
along.
guys are sat there going, pointing at you going, he's built 100 distilleries. More than 100.
Yeah, it is interesting because some of them are marketing guys, some of them are brand owners. There are a few distillers, but not a huge number of distillers. So I like to think I'd bring something a little bit
I
different.
suspect so. If you're up against marketing guys, come on.
I don't understand marketing at all. But yeah, so I was a judge out there, and one of the really nice things about it is that, yes, they take us all around the world. We've been to Guadeloupe and Belgium and Mexico and all sorts before. And while they're there, they put on all these educational classes. So I mentioned the Rakia masterclass that happened out in China of all places 1 year. But they also take us to visit lots of distilleries in the locality. So again, in Guadeloupe, we went to every distillery in Guadeloupe and Marie-Galante to see the rum agricole being made, including in pot stills, which was lovely.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started recording, because I've visited all those distilleries as well, and they are magical, especially on Marie-Galante, which I think is one of the best little distilling islands in the world, actually.
It's lovely. Yeah. And let's face it, yeah, the weather's nice. And,
you're in the Caribbean.
and the scenery's beautiful, and you've got these products, beautiful products to taste as well. It's lovely. China was a little bit more challenging, I suppose, in some ways, because these products, Baijiu, I think the 4 biggest spirits brands in the world are all Baijiu. And almost all of it is drunk within China itself. Hardly any of it comes out. And it is a really, really unusual product. And in the way it tastes, in the way it's presented, and particularly in the way it's made, it's absolutely extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. And actually on one of the other judges there, Anna, was from Mexico, and she's written a couple of papers about some of the similarities between some of the really basic Mexican stills and in the Philippines and in China as well. And it's quite interesting because how you can sort of understand how the Philippines and China could be similar and crossover and so on, but how that either came from Mexico or went to Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I was writing about this quite a lot last year because I've got a tequila and mezcal book coming out, and hence why I was in visiting mezcal distilleries, including the guy that was making the mango spirit. So there's a lot of uncertainty on the archaeology of this whole thing. But yes, there's there's great similarities between some of the sort of indigenous stills. This is pre-Columbian stills in Mexico. And stills, particularly in the Philippines, but also Chinese and Mongolian stills as well. The likely reason that they got there is because, or at least the reason that's suggested, is there was the Filipino, is it galleon trade between Philippines and Mexico? A lot of Filipino immigrants into Mexico during the early Columbian period, because Philippines was a Spanish colony. But there seems to have been local modifications that have happened that have made them seem more like old stills in China. So it's sort of almost like they've converged on a past there rather than it going off in a different direction. Very, very strange. And that's only really touching the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of the archaeology in Mexico and early distillation. We can get into that, but there's certain archaeological artifacts there that suggest distillation might have been taking place as long as 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, which is crazy and unproven, but nevertheless, it's fascinating to look into it.
Well, again, it's difficult when you visit China as a Westerner, because I don't speak a word of Mandarin or Chinese, any Chinese language, and so getting information sometimes can be really, really tricky. But we went to, they do think that they found some archaeological evidence for distilling from about 2000 BC in China, maybe even older. And it's but it's a very secretive country, isn't it? So it's difficult to know exactly how true all that is. And I was reading a story that they'd found some liquid as well that they think was from about 2000 years ago. And somebody's recreated it rather.
Residues and fermentations as well. Some of the oldest in the world, I think, go back to China. So sort of earliest examples of intentional alcohol production rather than kind of like, oh, let's just sat around a bit long before we packed up camp and moved on. Let's drink that kind of thing,
But it's funny you say that, because actually the process for making Baijiu isn't that dissimilar from it's like the earliest fermentation. People just used to wave their hand over it and say God is good and God will provide. And so God is good became the name for fermentation. It was just the natural yeasts that are in the air. And that's like the starter cultures in these incredible processes of making Baijiu. So the first time I went, we were in Fenyang province, which is the homeland of light aroma Baijiu. Whereas this last time we
I
was,
don't know if I should be more scared or less scared. Is that good?
well, the light aroma is probably the easiest one for the Western.
Because light might also mean like, I don't know, kind of sharp as well.
It's not quite as strongly flavoured as some of the others. And so there's about 12 different categories of Baijiu, and there are lots of different subcategories as well. So the first time we went to there was this light aroma, and then this last time I went last year, it was the home of sauce aroma, and it has notes of soy sauce and fermented residues in its both its aroma and its flavour. But again, that's part of the difficulties. They tend to use aroma for flavour as well.
So what's the base material?
So that depends where you are in China and which one of these aromas. So Fenyang, it was the light aroma. It was mainly rice. In Guizhou province, where we went last year, it was mainly sorghum and barley and a bit of wheat. But it can be made from any sort of grain. It's not like any fermentation process that we know really in the West. In that it's not a wet, it's not a liquid. It's a semi-moist process. So. And it's not really fermented with yeast either. It's more bacterial fermentation, although there are some wild yeasts involved in the process as well. And it is tied up with tradition as well. So the process is tied up with lunar celebrations, so phases of the moon and so on. When I was there last summer, it was just at the start of the whole process, in fact. And they start off by making this starter culture, which is, so they different areas of the country use different materials, but often it's peas and barley and wheat and oats sometimes as well. And they mix it with bacteria gathered from the local area and some wild yeast, presumably, as well.
Just go on a little foraging trip. I'll have a bit of that.
That's right.
Stuff them under this table. Let's stick some of that in there.
And in the area where we were, they were collected from this particular river valley, and so that's because I think they've got applied for the Chinese equivalent of whatever protected geographical indicators are.
Right, so they really believe that the location has the necessary bacteria to develop the style.
Absolutely, yeah. No, they were labouring that point all.
Not that I'm necessarily disagreeing with that, but it's interesting to sort of go from one very specific location within a region. You know, I would never have thought like, well, this riverbed is different to that hill.
Yeah.
But it sounds like that is the case here.
Yeah, I'm quite skeptical about the idea of terroir when it comes to spirits. Yeah, I can certainly accept it for wine and cider and so on, and fermented products. But for spirits, I just think you make so many changes once you distill it that I can't see any terroir left in there. Provenance, absolutely, yeah, 100%.
But then, you know, you've probably tasted spirits fermented using different yeasts, and you can, even after distillation, you find, right, that there's a difference. Yeah. So like, it's not too much of a stretch to say, well then, you know, I don't know, the Japanese Alps versus, you know, Southern Mediterranean, there's going to be potentially different wild yeast cultures because different flora and
that's certainly true,
fauna and what have you.
But there are so few people who use wild yeast for their
Sure. Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, no, I'm talking about natural fermentation here. Yeah, I think once you get into terroir of the base material, I agree. There's too many steps there in place to eradicate any nuance that material might have had. So when you start seeing like, I think even barley varieties possibly is too much in whiskey. Too many different steps there and then when you start talking about fields and things like that, agave spirits, terroir's a big topic there. And there's definitely a sort of, I think the industry over in Mexico, even amongst the sort of really great producers, some of them are pushing the terroir thing, and others are a bit less confident that is actually a thing.
I mean, I'd like to be proven wrong, and I'd like somebody to. And there are lots of people, particularly on whiskey, messing around with different barleys and from different fields and trying to establish it. But so much that I've seen where people have claimed terroir and the product is different, and the product is different, is just because they've distilled it in a different way from one season to the next.
In tequila, some people have a sort of part of the consensus that there is a terroir, because in tequila you have sort of two regions. The Tequila Valley, which is somewhere around 1,200 meters elevation, and you have Los Altos, which is I think sort of 1,900 meters elevation. It's about 500 meter difference. And for a long time, they've talked about sourcing agaves from Los Altos and tequila and how it makes a difference to the product. Some people think actually it's not the agaves themselves, although the agaves, if you analyze them, they are different. They're not so different though that it makes a difference when you finally come to a bottled product. But what some people do think makes a difference is the altitude, and you get slightly different boiling points, slightly.
Yeah.
And also different yeast potentially if you are doing a natural fermentation. And quite a lot of producers at the higher end do have some form of natural fermentation going on. They might start it with natural and then pitch other yeasts and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So there may be a terroir regionally based on the ferment rather than the material itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, is it even when it comes down to gin? Because I mean, you know Tom Nicol very well, don't you? And he did some consultancy for somebody with a gin distillery up in the Alps somewhere. So you're distilling at a very high altitude, and it's going to boil at a different temperature, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. Boiling point's an interesting one. So we were talking earlier about the progression of the gin run and how the temperature of the inside the still changes. If that entire temperature range shifts by 3 degrees up or down, that's going to change what you extract out of those botanicals.
Exactly. Yeah. Now you can negate that by changing the ABV of the charge, of course. So,
you could.
Anyway, it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. So anyway, back to Baijiu.
Oh yeah. So we're in this. The main town there is called Mutai, and there are 800 distilleries grouped in and around this town, and that's roughly the same number as there are in the whole of the UK.
That's crazy. That is nuts. Do you remember when everyone used to say, that the Speyside has the highest concentration of distilleries in the world? And then for a long time, I was like, no, I think it's Haiti. Because there's like 450 distilleries in Haiti, right? No one really knows of any of them, though. And then I was like, maybe it's Oaxaca, because you've got towns in Oaxaca with like 200 distilleries. But you're saying 800 around the same area.
Yeah. It's quite extraordinary.
Wow.
And 2 of those distilleries are absolutely massive, 2 of the biggest distilleries in the whole world. Lots and lots of smaller ones as well. But it was just absolutely extraordinary.
It's crazy.
And so they make this starter culture, as we discussed, and it traditionally it would be trod like treading grapes with and it would be trod at a certain time and phase of the moon and made into a brick which is allowed to dry, and they have to stack it in 3 different stacking patterns for it to work properly for some weird reason. Again, not really explained. Then they get in the grains, sorghum and wheat, I think mainly in this particular area, add some of this starter culture and pile it up and damp it down a little bit. But it's just damp grains effectively. And it's aerobic then, and it ferments like anything. Temperatures of 50 to 60 degrees centigrade inside this stack. And once it's done that for about a month, they then bury it in a clay pit.
You wonder if it doesn't kill the yeast, but then is it bacteria as well?
Exactly, yeah. And then it's buried for a month. Then they dig it all out again, buried in clay pits. Dig it all out again, add more of the starter culture, a bit more of the cereal again, and it's buried again. And at the end of the second fermentation phase, they dig it out and then put it into a still. And the still effectively is a simple pot. Historically, it would have had a fire underneath it, but now they inject steam at the bottom. They really carefully layer the fermented material into it and put bits of husk in there as well. And that really acts then almost like a packed column on a simple column still. And so as the steam rises up through this fermented material, it picks up the alcohol. And then
So no water is ever added to this?
No.
So it's a vapor extraction through this dry husk. The yield must be...
Of a semi-moist.
Semi-moist. But it must be pathetic yields, right? Like, surely.
It's not great. And then the lid of the still is just placed on top with a sort of seal around it. But it's not weighted down other than by running water through it, cold water. And so as that hot steam carrying the alcohol vapor rises up inside the pot, it hits the cold surface, runs down to a point and out through a channel, and it comes out typically at 53% ABV, straight into a...
Is it condensing internally inside the still and then dropping down into a catching vessel? So this is similar to a lot of stills in Mexico.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the drawings, you couldn't really tell if it was Chinese or Mexican.
Yeah.
And then they collect in these ceramic vessels, and then some of the brands are aged for up to 50 years inside ceramics, and they're really expensive. And then that fermented, once it's been distilled, They then add more grain and more of the starter culture, and that goes back in the pits. And that whole process is repeated 6 or 7 times. And each time the quality of the alcohol is not quite so good, and the yield is reduced a little bit as well. So the second runnings, the third runnings, whatever you want to call them, go off for sort of inferior brands.
It's just remarkable, like the length of time it takes to do it.
Yeah.
The sort of attention to detail, the almost like religiosity of it.
Yeah.
Full moon, stacking it in a certain way. The complete disregard for efficiency or yield.
Yeah.
And the sort of primitive nature of the stills themselves. Like, it's just a shame it doesn't taste great. I'm willing to be proven wrong here in a second, but like,
I'm sort of with you on that one, to be honest. But it is an extraordinary process. And we went to see a dozen distilleries, say, and they were all doing it in the same way. And there's just building after building after building, all looking identical, with clay pit after clay pit after clay pit. And so you've got flavours in there which are sort of almost like rotting grain and compost. You've got clay in the sauce aroma. You've got clay flavours from the clay pit, and that's a characteristic flavour. There's sort of notes of almost like butyric acid and stuff, like parmesan and things like that in there as well.
I mean, that's something that I always associate with Baijiu.
Yeah.
It's this sharp, acidic kind of.
And different categories, different aromas have that to a greater or lesser extent as well. And in the sauce aroma that we were at, you got the sort of toasty notes from this high temperature aerobic fermentation part as well.
So to the point where it's kind of cooking basically. So it's almost you get like a kind of Maillard reaction thing going on. Yeah.
And then we went to one of the so Mutai is the biggest distillery, I think, and that's the Baijiu we tend to see, if you see it at all over here in the UK. That's the one we tend to see. It's in a sort of white ceramic bottle with red print on it. And when I came back, I stopped off at didn't stop off, sorry. I had to change planes at Munich airport, and I popped into duty free, and there was a bottle of those Mutai Baijiu for £435, I think.
Whoa!
So it's not cheap.
And is their process similar, just at scale, or they kind of managed to industrialize it in a?
No, that's what I was coming on to. So they were just doing exactly the same way as it's always been done, just throwing loads of people at it with shovels. And I'll show you afterwards some of the videos I took. It's just it's.
I did see some of the stuff you put up on social media at the time.
It's almost medieval. It's incredible, yeah. But then we went to this other distillery, which unfortunately wasn't operating because it was right at the start of the whole process. And they've automated it, loads of robots doing everything. But instead of changing the way the product is made, they've just made robots and built robots to do exactly what the human was doing. And so the process is exactly the same, but now with far, far fewer people. But that's
got robots sort of digging these sort of like compost pits.
It's coming, it's grabbing a bit and putting a bit in, and then getting some husk and putting some husk in. And it's layering it, so it's spinning around and around to make sure it's nicely layered.
That is such a strangely contrasted thing to observe, I imagine.
It was weird. And in the more traditional one, you had 3 or 4 people with baskets, sort of very skillfully throwing this thing in to layer it. It was quite a process.
I mean, it puts a whole new spin on like craft distilling when you see stuff like this. I mean, I had it in Mexico recently. I've seen it in other places too, where you're like, oh no, this is craft, where it's this labor. And I mean, it's like if you had a farmer who was like dragging a plow around with a mule and they're sowing seeds by hand, you'd be like, right, well, that is just the least efficient way you could possibly be doing this. Yeah. And it's sort of that, but for making booze.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I was talking to a couple of young Chinese people there at the risk of saying like a creepy old man. I said, well, what do you like doing in the evening? And they were saying, oh yeah, we like to go out to a bar. So I said, well, what do you drink? And I was fully expecting them to say Baijiu, but they said, no, it's far too expensive. So we'll buy a bottle of beer. And to be honest, she said, we make it last all evening if we can, and we play dominoes with our friends, or cards with our friends. And Baijiu is seen as an older person's drink now, even in China, despite the fact that there are still huge quantities being drunk, but it is seen as being slightly old-fashioned, certainly for older people. And it's brought out and drunk in huge quantities at celebrations, of course, and that's when the younger people tend to drink it. But other than that, they tend to prefer beer now.
Yeah, and they just drink it straight, Baijiu, or is it mixed?
So typically it comes off of around about 52% ABV. It's drunk neat, and it does taste challenging to the Western palate.
Let's try one of these. You don't have to open both, but whatever you think.
But I did find that whilst I was there, we were treated really well, and we were taken out to banquet after banquet after banquet. And with food, with proper Chinese food, actually that's where it really came into its own, and that was lovely.
Funny you should say that. I was once in Shanghai and out with a bunch of Chinese bartenders, and we were at this very old-fashioned Chinese restaurant. There's a side story to this actually. The floor of the restaurant had metal hoops on the ground, right? Mm-hmm. I was like, what are those hoops there for? Like, what could you possibly need a metal hoop, like sort of bolted into the ground? Apparently this place, many years ago, used to do live donkey sashimi. They would bring a sedated donkey in and just start and flay it and then start cutting bits off for the customers. So that kind of put me off my food a little bit. And by the way, the food itself consisted of sort of marinated intestines and lung and stuff like that. Tasted kind of, the flavor was good, like the spicing and everything, but it was a weird gelatinous texture that we're just not that used to in the West, you know? Anyway, lots of shots of Baijiu are being done because they have these sort of rituals of like someone stands up, everyone does a shot. And that night I vomited aggressively, wildly. And all I could smell was it wasn't the Chinese spicing on the food. It wasn't the intestines, thank God. It was the Baijiu. Yeah. And so, in fact, I don't know if I've had any since, but oh, wow.
So if I'm brutally honest, I don't know where these two bottles are coming from. I just found them on my shelf. Neither of them have a letter in English on the labels. So
we can't really say much about them.
I can only see the numbers, and it says 52% ABV on both products.
So it's got that, and it's so intensely pineapple-y, this, I think. It's like pineapple esters that you get in a candy in what I would imagine like the sweet manufacturer might buy in the most concentrated form before they distribute it out amongst tons of sugared sweets.
Exactly, and that's one of the characteristics of certain aroma categories of Baijiu. And I'm not clever enough to be able to tell you which aroma type this one is yet. But yeah, some of them you do get and you're right, it's that sort of artificial pineapple.
Yeah. And then there's a slight dirtiness underneath that, like an earthy. I actually don't, I mean, it's so unusual. It doesn't smell like it's going to be that tasty, but it's an interesting smell. Oh God.
So that I'd say is strong aroma, which makes up about 60%, I think, of all the Baijiu made.
Yeah, that's... It's not very often I drink a spirit and make that face, but it's not even the strength. It's that initial hit. It whacks you, right? Yeah. It's so potent. Like, it's so concentrated, the flavor. There's no getting away from it. I mean, there's, for me personally, and maybe it's because it's one of the strong ones, there's not much left for sort of nuance in there. Like it's so hard to get around the initial whack of like intense. It's like dark fermented pineapple, but just concentrated like 100x.
Yes, it is. I mean, the flavors are intense, and there are some pretty. Yeah, there's fish. There's a roast or a fatty pork aroma Baijiu, where literally pork is fermented along with it as well.
There's something rancid about it as well.
Yeah,
like a kind of off butter kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. And those are product pluses.
It's rancid fat with. I know I keep saying pineapple, and some people are probably thinking, "Oh, I like pineapple. Doesn't seem so bad." But this is a sort of strange distortion of what pineapple is.
Yeah,
it's that heavy top note pineapple, without the sort of plumpness of the fruit as well.
Yeah.
It's like a nightmare. It's like if a pineapple had a nightmare.
It is. And in the background, you've got that sort of butyric acid type thing as well.
Wow.
And things like acetone. And so on. Those things are product plus as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is it. There's some gluiness to it. it tastes slightly unsafe, I would say, by our kind of
Yeah.
sort of sensibilities and what we would expect a spirit to taste like. Because I don't know if it is sour, but there is sort of acidic connotations there, you know?
Yeah, lactic acid is a descriptor that's often used for it.
It lingers.
It does. But with food,
Yeah, I mean,
work
I
really
think it
nicely.
would be better with food. I really do, because then there's something to take your mind off the Baijiu a little bit.
So we went to a dozen or so Baijiu distilleries last year as well, and then I sat through 2 days of a Baijiu masterclass, which was, I say sat too, I really enjoyed it. It was really fascinating. And then I got a little certificate, so I'm a Baijiu ambassador. So I'm supposed to say good things about it.
It's going well so far.
It's really difficult.
Going well.
Thankfully, it's time limited. It's only for 5 years.
They might, well, maybe they'll want to cash that one in early. But that's cool. I mean, it's just such an interesting spirit category. Like I said, the number of distilleries, the crafting process of the whole thing. And it's just entirely ignored by us over here, you know.
Biggest selling spirits in the world.
Yeah, and that as well.
And
yeah.
hardly anybody over here knows it. And if they do try it, hardly anybody actually likes it.
That is it. Definition of acquired taste. Well, maybe in 5 years you'll have got there.
There's a challenge for you is to work that into a cocktail, isn't it?
That is a challenge. I think it might be that botanical that someone wants to include but is deadly. So let's put a very small amount in, you know? Oh, great. Okay, cool. Well, look, shall we finish up there? I think we've done a couple of hours here at least. So that's probably...
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. No, it's such a great conversation. And great to sit down and chat and hear about your journey, but also, I think, hear about your exploits in setting up these distilleries and then to finish on some Baijiu.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Jamie Baxter, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Tris.